Kalen came to after hitting the ground. The foreign memories hadn't yet settled in his mind, yet he was already being dragged by the collar through the mud across the entire square of the village of Turvan. Standing around him were men in gray cloaks with an iron ring emblem. There were 6 of them. They were carrying tools out of the smithy and loading them onto a cart. Hammers, pliers, bundles of raw metal. 2 of them were dragging the anvil on straps and cursing its weight. A broad man with scorched hands stood at the smithy door, watching silently. The foreign memory suggested a name. Blacksmith Dargo. The only blacksmith in 3 valleys. The man who had dragged Kalen threw him into a puddle in front of the cart and said that this puppy had been throwing stones at the guild members and that the village would pay a separate fine for it. Kalen lay in the cold water, piecing himself back together. He remembered another life, a long one. 80 years by the forge, the workbench, and the drawing board. He was a master craftsman summoned to the courts of 3 empires. He died an old man in his workshop, a chisel in his hand. And now he lay in a puddle, in the body of 19-year-old Kalen Dre, a village misfit who had been expelled from his apprenticeship in the city for lack of talent. The body was gaunt. His hands were bony. His stomach had been empty since yesterday. A man in a fine cloak with a fur collar stood over him. A stranger's memory named him too. Merrick, the collector from the Iron Circle Guild. Merrick spoke loudly so that the entire square could hear him. He said that the village of Turvan owed the guild 47 silver marks for the right to operate a blacksmith shop. That the deadline had passed last month. That, according to the guild's bylaws, the guild would seize the tools to settle the debt. And that if the debt wasn't paid in full within 12 days, the smithy would be sealed shut forever, and the village would lose the right to practice any craft other than farming. Kalen sat down in a puddle and looked around through the eyes of a master craftsman. And what he saw was worse than the debt. The collector's cart stood on wheels with bent spokes. The rim of one wheel was reinforced with iron that had pitted. That kind of iron cracks at the first frost. The axes at the guards' belts were overheated. He could tell by the color of the cutting edge. The plow by the village headman's fence had been forged with an unsealed seam. The bucket by the well was leaking along a riveted seam. The entire village lived among poorly made things. The people here didn't even know how to make a nail that wouldn't bend. And judging by the guild members' tools, the city wasn't much better. Meanwhile, Merrick approached Dargo and jabbed his finger into his chest. He said he knew about the stash of finished horseshoes and that he would come tomorrow to search the place. Dargo clenched his fists and said nothing. His daughter, Isla, about 16 years old, stood in the doorway of the smithy, holding her father's small hammer in her hands. She was hiding it behind her back like a child. The guard noticed and stepped toward her. And just then, Kalen rose from the puddle. He didn't even have time to think. His old life was driving his feet. He stepped between the guard and the girl and said that the guild's hammer with the cracked cheek was of no use. The guard froze. Kalen took the hammer from Isla and turned it toward the light. There was no crack. But he ran his fingernail along the brand and said that the tempering was gone and that such a tool was worth a copper coin on market day. He spoke calmly, in the voice of a man who appraised items for the royal inventories. Merrick narrowed his eyes and asked the town elder who this ragged fellow was. Elder Hald replied that it was Kalen Dre, the son of the late widow Dre, the very same one who'd been expelled from the city's apprentices. Merrick laughed, and the entire guard laughed with him. Merrick said that if the only expert on iron in this backwater was an expelled apprentice, then he had no worries about the debt. He said he would return at noon in 12 days, and that he would accept payment in cash or in goods he could sell in town. He surveyed the square and added that this village wouldn't produce 47 marks worth of goods even in a year. the cart began to move. A crooked wheel clattered along the frozen ruts. Kalen watched it go and counted. The wheel had 300 steps left to go before reaching the first rock on the descent. It cracked at the 280th step. The cart tipped to one side. The anvil slid off and crushed the side of the cart. The guard howled for an hour, pushing the cart, while the village watched in silence. Merrick rode off on horseback, angry as a wasp. The guild members took the tools anyway, transferring them to a second cart. But for the first time that day, the village smiled. And Kalen stood there, listening to the sound echoing in his head. The sound had come when the wheel snapped, even and quiet as a tuning fork. Before his eyes unfolded a window of pale golden light that only he could see. At the top of the window was an inscription: the Universal Craftsman system. Below, the system wrote slowly, like a pen on paper. It wrote that it welcomed the bearer, that the bearer had lived the life of a master and died with the unfulfilled desire to pass on everything he knew, that now a single law prevailed. Any skill the bearer passes on to another person will return to the bearer amplified 1,000-fold. Below that, a condition was written in large characters. The return does not occur at the moment of explanation. The return occurs the moment the apprentice repeats the skill on their own for the first time without the bearer's help. Kalen read it twice. The old master inside him smiled. His entire past life had been built on the opposite principle. Back then, knowledge was hidden away. Workshops kept their secrets under lock and key. A master would take his techniques to the grave rather than let them fall into a competitor's hands. But here, the world rewarded him for sharing everything. He looked at his new hands, skinny, weak. His old skills didn't live in these hands anyway. His body couldn't hold a hammer or a chisel. But his mind remembered everything. And if the system wasn't lying, then by giving away his knowledge, he would receive it back in a form that no one had ever possessed before. He turned toward the smithy. Darg sat on the threshold of the ransacked workshop, staring at the floor. They'd taken everything from him except for the forge, which they hadn't been able to pry out of the masonry, and a pile of scrap iron in the corner. Rusty shards, bent strips, junk. Kalen walked over and sat down beside him. He said the debt could be settled with goods. Dargo replied, without looking up, that without tools he couldn't even forge a single bracket. Kalen said that tools were made from iron, and there was iron right there in the corner. Dargo raised his head and looked at him as if he were a fool. He said that rusty scrap produced nothing but more rusty scrap. That any apprentice knew that. Kalen picked up a bent strip from the pile and held it up to the light. The strip was made of low-grade iron with veins of slag. Junk by any smithy's standards. But he knew something about this junk that no one else here knew. He said he'd show them one thing, just one, and if it didn't work, he'd keep quiet forever. Dargo stared at him for a long time, then at the empty forge, then at his daughter, who was warming her hands by the cooling bellows. He had nothing to lose. He nodded. Kalen asked for 3 things: river sand from the shallows at the ford, ash from birchwood, and crushed eggshells from the chicken coop. Isla brought everything within an hour. Dargo stoked the bellows with the last of the coals. Kalen didn't touch the iron. He stood to the side and spoke. He explained that the slag in the iron could be removed by heating the metal under a layer of the right mixture, folding the strip in half, and forging it again. He explained at what point the color of the sparks would indicate that the iron was becoming purer. He explained why the mixture of sand, ash, and eggshells trapped the heat and drew out the impurities. Dargo listened with a frown. The blacksmith's hands moved hesitantly. He ruined the first strip. He overheated the second. On the third try, something clicked in his mind. He folded the metal, sprinkled the mixture, forged it, folded it again. Sparks of a different color flew from under the hammer, white and short. Dargo pulled the strip out of the forge and froze. The metal's fracture glistened with an even gray grain, without a single cavity. The blacksmith, with 40 years at the anvil, held in his tongs the finest iron he'd ever seen in his life. And he'd made it himself. From scrap. In a single evening. He slowly turned to Kalen and opened his mouth. And at that moment, a bell rang in Kalen's head. A golden window flashed before his eyes. The system reported that the condition had been met. Darg's apprentice had independently replicated the purification of crinic iron. The transferred skill returns to its bearer 1,000-fold. First-level divine metallurgy skill acquired. And knowledge flooded in. Kalen grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. Things that had never existed in his past world unfolded in his memory. He could see right through metal, down to the very grain. He knew by heart the alloys that sang in the frost and the alloys that drank lightning. He knew how to forge steel that remembers its shape. How to forge in a crucible a metal as light as a pine plank and as hard as winter ice. Hundreds of recipes, thousands of techniques. An entire science he could have spent 10 more lifetimes studying. It simply lay within his head now, as naturally as his native tongue. He gave the village blacksmith a single evening lesson. The world had restored him to the pinnacle of his craft. Kalen stood in the dark smithy, breathing. Darg was saying something to him. Isla was asking him something. He didn't hear them. He was looking at a pile of rusty scrap in the corner and saw 47 silver marks in it. And he also saw the number the system had displayed at the bottom of the window in small characters. There were 11 days and 19 hours left until the collector, Merrick, returned. And beneath that line, the system had added one final note. It stated that a carrier's enhanced abilities leave a trace in objects, and that people capable of reading such traces exist, and that the first of them was already on the road to Turvin. The morning began with a knock. Dargo was pounding on the door of the widow Dre's house before dawn. Kalen opened the door, and the blacksmith practically dragged him into the smithy. Yesterday's strip of metal lay on the workbench. Dargo hadn't slept all night. He'd bent it, hammered it, and frozen it in a barrel, yet it hadn't broken. He said the city armorer would give his right arm for a strip like that. Then he paused and added that he didn't understand the main point. He asked how an expelled apprentice knew what even the guildmasters didn't know. Kalen was prepared for the question. He replied that he'd been expelled from the city not for lack of talent, but for sticking his nose into the guild's forbidden books, and that he had more knowledge in his head than the guild would have liked. The lie went down smoothly. It explained everything, and there was no way to verify it. Dargo grunted and said he didn't care where it came from. He did care about what came next. Kalen laid out a plan before him. 11 days. From the scrap metal in the corner, they wouldn't make horseshoes or staples. You can't pay off a debt with horseshoes. They'd make knives. 20 knives made of pure iron with a welded steel edge, a technique Kalen had now mastered, forging it in a pot of river sand and coal dust. A knife like that could shave a nail and hold a hair on its blade. In town, they'd pay 3 marks for one like that. For 20, they'd pay off more of the debt. Dargo listened and didn't believe it. Then he remembered yesterday's strip of metal and believed it halfway. That was enough. The work came to a standstill for 4 days and then proceeded in fits and starts. On the first day, Dargo learned to smelt crucible steel and ruined 6 smeltings in a row, but on the 7th, he brought it out into the light, and it rang like a bell under the hammer. A small bell rang in Kalen's head, and the system restored his second-level crucible operations. That very evening, he silently recalculated the charge composition, and the next smeltings went without any defects. On the second day, Isla asked to work at the forge. Dargo forbade it. Kalen asked the blacksmith who would draw the wire and rivet the shackles when orders reached 20 a day. Dargo thought it over and gave his permission. Isla learned faster than her father. Her fingers were more precise, and her eyes were younger. By the evening of the third day, she had drawn her first smooth wire all on her own, without any prompting. The bell rang again, and Kaylin had mastered the art of wire drawing, enough to make a golden chain for a crown. On the fourth day, 18 knives lay on the workbench. Dargo took the last one and used it to shave dry in front of a shard of mirror. There were no cuts. The blacksmith looked at his reflection, and his face was that of a man who had been walking in the wrong direction for 40 years and had just been shown the way. The rumor spread through the village on its own. The village elder, Hald, was the first to arrive. He came to scold him. From the threshold, he began saying that unauthorized craftsmanship without the guild seal was a noose around the entire village's neck and that he forbade it. Dargo silently handed him a knife and a log. Hald planed it mechanically. The blade stripped off shavings as long and transparent as a ribbon. Hald planed it once more. Then he sat down on the log and was silent for a long time. Then he asked how many of these could be made before Merrick arrived. That was his way of apologizing. Kaylin replied that it wasn't about the quantity. The knives would settle the debt once and for all. But the debt would grow every year because the guild feeds off debts. The village must not pay. The village must become a place that others take seriously. Hald looked at him as if he were a boy who had spoken with an old man's voice and walked away to think. On the fifth day, a guest arrived in Turvan, the one the system had warned about. He did not come for the blacksmith's fame. He was traveling through the valley toward the city with a caravan and stopped to replace a broken axle. His name was Sorgat. A mid-level merchant from the city of Vreden, 5 wagons, 8 guards. The bored expression of a man who's been hauling the same cargo for 20 years. While they were replacing the axle, he walked around the village, his gaze sharp and piercing. He stopped by the well. The bucket was no longer leaking. It was bound with a strip of metal that had a wavy sheen, and even a fool could see that such a binding wasn't made anywhere in the valleys. Sorgat picked up the bucket and ran his fingers over the metal as one might read a letter. Then he asked the women whose iron it was. The women proudly replied that it belonged to the blacksmith Dargo. An hour later, Sorgat was sitting in the smithy. He placed a knife on the workbench, turned it toward the light, tested the edge against his fingernail, and named his price. 2 marks apiece for the entire batch. Dargo almost said yes. Kaylin said no. He said that the retail price for such a knife was 3 marks, but he'd sell the batch to a merchant for 2.5 marks each and throw in something Sorgat had never seen before. He laid an axe, forged last night, on the workbench. The axe's blade was made of shape-memory steel. In front of the merchant, Kaylin bent the edge against the anvil, and the edge straightened itself with a ringing sound. Sorgat stared at the axe without blinking. The boredom washed from his face like paint in the rain. He asked how much the secret of such steel cost. Kaylin replied that the secret was not for sale. The goods are for sale, and the goods will be available only here in Turvan and nowhere else. Sorgat didn't think twice. He bought all 18 knives and the axe and left a deposit for the next shipment. 52 silver marks were placed on the table. More than enough. Hald, who was present during the transaction, counted the money 3 times, his hands trembling. Before leaving, Sorgat took Kaylin over to the wagons and said quietly that he would offer some advice for free. He said that in a month, all of Vreden would be talking about this iron, that the Iron Circle Guild had crushed people far less powerful than this, and that the boy who forges impossible steel should decide right now who he wants to be, a supplier to the guild on his knees, or its enemy standing tall. The caravan left. That evening, the system opened a window, and Kaylin read lines that sent a chill down his spine. The system stated that the sold items bore the mark of an enhanced skill, that the mark was indelible, and that at least one person living in the city of Vreden was capable of seeing the mark and realizing that what the guilds had considered buried had returned to the world. Kaylin closed the window and looked at the horn. It was too late to retreat. The blades were already on their way to the city. There was only one direction left, forward, faster than the news itself. On the 6th day, he went to the house by the river dam where the weaver Nera lived. People said she was the best spinner in the 3 valleys, and that her temper was worse than stinging nettles. She opened the door, looked down at him, and said that the miracle blacksmith had chosen the wrong trade. Kalen replied that he had brought her a thread that could not be broken by hand, and he held out a skein of thin wire drawn by Isla. Nera took the skein between 2 fingers. She tugged at it. Then she braced herself and tugged with all her might. The wire sang and did not give way. Nera looked at her white-knuckled fingers, then at Kalen, and stepped aside in the doorway. Inside the house stood her late mother's loom. Kalen walked around it and said he would show her a pattern found in no other valley, and that if she wove a metal thread into the warp using a special interlacing technique, the fabric would hold a knife. Nera snorted that fabric wasn't chainmail. Kalen asked for 3 days. Nera gave him 1. And that evening, watching her nimble, precise fingers fly over the loom faster than he could explain, Kalen thought for the first time that the system had chosen the perfect world for the return of skills. A world where talent lay neglected in the mud in villages, unwanted by anyone. And it waited for only one thing, for someone to start giving it away. Nera ruined his plan within the very first hour. Kalen explained the thread crossover to her as he would to an apprentice, slowly and step by step. She cut him off and said she could see where the pattern was going and that his method of the weft was crooked because the thread would rub against the edge of the warp. And she offered her own method. Kalen looked at her hands and realized she was right. His knowledge of weaving was the knowledge of a stranger's craft, seen from the outside. But she had lived within that craft for 30 years. He fell silent and began to speak only of things she couldn't possibly know, about how the metal thread absorbs and distributes the impact, and about the angle at which the fiber must meet the blade. Her fingers did the rest. By sunset, a scrap the size of 2 palms hung from the loom, a gray cloth with a barely noticeable wave running through it. Nera laid it on a log, took her father's knife, and struck it from above with all her fury. The knife slipped off. A dent remained on the fabric, but not a single cut. Nera stood there staring at the scrap. Then she struck it 4 more times. Then she sat down on a bench and began to cry. Kalen was at a loss. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve and said that her husband had been killed while logging by a hook that had snapped loose, and that if he'd been wearing a jacket like this, he'd still be alive, and that now she wanted to know everything about this fabric. A bell rang in Kalen's head. The system returned the transmitted information amplified 1,000-fold, and he was nearly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of it. The magic of the protective fabric. He now knew of a cloth that could stop an arrow mid-flight, a fabric that dampens heat so a person can walk through a burning house, a fabric that keeps you from drowning, a thread that gathers the morning light and radiates its warmth in the frost, patterns that protect a house from rot and decay, a whole world of fabrics that hadn't even been heard of in his past life. He stood in the middle of a humble house by the weir, envisioning garments for an entire civilization. The work spanned 2 houses. In the smithy, Dargo and Isla smelted steel and drew thread for the loom. By the weir, Nera wove, and 2 days later she brought 2 widowed friends with golden hands and perpetually empty cauldrons. Kalen taught everyone. He quickly grasped a simple truth. The more talented the student, the faster independent success comes, and the faster the decline. The student's talent was his own pace. The village didn't yet understand what was happening, but it already sensed it. Now there was always a man standing by the blacksmith shop, watching. At the dam, the women found excuses to walk past Nera's windows. Hald wandered between the houses like a cat around cream, grumbling aloud about the guild while counting to himself. On the 10th day, he had to start counting in earnest. Merrick rode into Turvin a day ahead of schedule. He arrived not with 6 guards, but with 12, and with an empty cart for confiscated goods. He rode into the square, unfurled the scroll, and began reading while still in the saddle. He read that the Iron Circle Guild had learned of illegal craftsmanship in the village of Turvin, specifically the sale of forged goods without the guild seal. He stated that, according to the charter, this was punishable by the confiscation of all produced goods and a fine of 100 marks in addition to the existing debt. He lowered the scroll and smiled. He had been waiting for this day for 12 years while he squeezed every last drop out of this village. A crowd had gathered in the square. Kalen stepped forward and asked whether the guild would accept payment of the debt in cash as promised. Merrick laughed and replied that the debt now amounted to 147 marks and that this filthy village could not raise that much money even if it sold all its cows. Kalen nodded to Hald. The village elder brought out a chest and opened it in front of the saddle. Inside the chest, arranged in neat columns, lay 150 silver marks. These were Sorgat's down payment, the proceeds from the sale, and the communal treasury collected over 3 days from the households, because, for the first time, the village had believed in something together. The square fell silent. Merrick stared into the chest, and a smile slipped from his face as slowly as wax from a hot candle. Kalen loudly asked the village head to recount the money in the presence of witnesses and asked the clerk collector to issue a receipt confirming full repayment of the debt and the fine in accordance with the guild's charter. He pronounced the word charter distinctly and with emphasis. The clerk looked at Merrick. The charter was a trap for both sides. Refusal to accept full payment in the presence of witnesses would deprive the guild of any right to that debt at all. Merrick knew the charter better than anyone else in the valley. He dismounted, took the receipt from the clerk, and signed it with an expression as if he were signing his own death warrant. Then he stepped right up close to Kalen and whispered that he'd seen such clever types before, that the guild had ruined villages before, and far worse, and that he would personally bring the guildmaster here, and then no chest would help. He rode off. The village exhaled and buzzed with activity. The men were rocking the Hald. The women were dragging tables into the square. Kalen stood aside, feeling no joy. He watched the tax collector leave and realized that he had just bought the village not freedom, but a reprieve, and that the next one wouldn't be coming for money. That evening, at the festival, Dargo sat down next to him. The blacksmith was tipsy and serious. He said he'd spoken with a passing cart driver. Word of Turvin iron was already spreading in the city. Gunsmiths had bought up all of Sorgat's knives in a single day and resold them for triple the price. The cart driver also mentioned that a man from the hill had taken an interest in the knives. That was how they referred in the city to Master Vale Cross, the head of the Iron Circle Guild. The cart driver spoke of Cross in a whisper. He said that Cross had started out as a simple foundryman and now controlled the iron of 3 provinces, that he had no competitors because their forges were set ablaze, and that Cross possessed a special gift. He could take any object in his hands and see the hand that had made it. Kalen slowly set down his mug. The system hadn't lied. A man who could read traces did exist, and the trace was already lying on his table. The festival was in full swing all around, but Kalen was thinking. The village didn't need knives. The village needed walls, people, crafts that couldn't be taken away along with the tools because they lived in the hands of the craftsmen, and it needed a builder. The next morning, he went to the edge of the village, to old Tob's crooked house. They said that Tob had once built in Vraden itself, and that he'd been kicked out of the Masons Guild for arguing with the foreman over a dome that, by all calculations, was bound to collapse. The dome was still standing, and Tob had spent the last 30 years drinking and repairing sheds. Kalen found him on the porch. He laid a birch bark sheet with a blueprint in front of him and said he wanted to build a house that couldn't be burned down. Taba stared at the blueprint for a long time with cloudy eyes. Then his eyes began to clear. He asked what kind of mortar was indicated in the corners of the bundle. Kalen replied that it was a mortar that hardens when exposed to fire rather than cracking, and that he would show him how to mix it. Tob got up from the porch. He stood unsteadily, but his gaze was already clear and eager. And that very morning, across the valley on the road from Vreden, a covered wagon without coats of arms was traveling. Seated in the wagon was a thin man wearing gloves that he did not remove even in the heat. On his lap lay a turven knife wrapped in canvas. From time to time, the man would place his palm on the bundle, and each time, his face would take on the expression of a hound that had picked up a scent. Tob had sobered up in 3 days, and this in itself was considered a miracle in the village. He mixed the mortar as if performing a sacred rite, crushed stone from the cliff, ash, clay from the riverbed, and a binding agent that Kalin had told only him about. They built their first test wall, an elbow high, behind the smithy. Out of habit, Tob expected the masonry to take a week to dry. By evening, the masonry had set. Then, at Kalin's request, Dargo blew the bellows, brought out a shovel of coals, and poured them directly onto the wall. The coals burned down to gray ash. The wall didn't even darken. Tob touched it with his palm, and his palm felt only a slight warmth. The old man turned to Kalin and said that he had been laying stone for 40 years, and that all this time, it turned out, he had been laying it the way a child stacks kindling. On the 4th day, Tob, on his own and without prompting, mixed the mortar, adjusting the proportion of ash to the local clay, and the test arch he built with his own hands withstood the weight of a cart. A bell rang in Kalin's head so loudly that his vision darkened. The return journey was the hardest of all. Living architecture. He sank down onto a log and sat there while the knowledge settled in. He now knew of houses that grow, not like a tree, but like a shell. Masonry that fuses into a single stone and heals its own cracks. Walls that breathe, retaining warmth in winter and coolness in summer. Towers that drink in the wind and power millstones without any river. Bridges that grow stronger under load. He knew how to lay a pattern in the foundation that would allow the house to sense fire, water, and uninvited guests. In his past life, such a thing would have been called a fairy tale. Here, it was now simply called his craft. They began building right away, working through the short, harsh days. Here, Tob is marking out the outline of the communal house on the vacant lot behind the square, and 7 men are looking at the stakes with skepticism. A week later, the walls are already chest high, the mortar sings beneath the trowel, and the skepticism has given way to a line of people eager to hand up stones. Here, Isla is casting the first glass panes for the windows from river sand, according to Kalin's blueprint, and behind her stand 5 girls, breathing down her neck. Now the communal house has a roof, and Tob is spending the night inside on the workbench because he can't tear himself away from his own work. The house turned out so impressive that carts on the road would stop to look. Gray stone with a warm sheen, tall windows with glass that wasn't even available in the city. The walls tapered upward smoothly like the sides of a boat, and if you looked closely, a barely perceptible wave moved slowly along the mortar joints. The house was alive, and the village could feel it. Inside, they set up shared workbenches, a communal forge, and long tables. Kalin called it a school. Hald called it a future gallows for all of them, but he said it without malice. People began to arrive. First, their own people from Turvin. Then 2 Cooper brothers came from the neighboring valley. After that, a dark-skinned, silent girl named Verda arrived on a mule from a mountain village, and it turned out that she was the best potter in the region, and that her kiln had been built with a flaw she sensed but could not name. Kalin identified the flaw in a minute and spent the next 3 days teaching her how to create a glaze that rings. When Verda pulled the first bowl, the color of deep water, out of the kiln, and the bowl sang like a bell at the touch of a fingernail, Kalin was introduced to a potter's art that took his breath away. Porcelain thinner than an eggshell and stronger than bone. Clay that keeps water cold for a month. Roof tiles that hail cannot damage. Gathered around him were exactly the things he'd been thinking about at the festive table. Hands. Talented hands from all over the region that had been of no use to anyone their whole lives. And most of these hands belonged to women and the elderly, because the city sucked the talented young men into the workshops, while the guilds simply didn't see these people. The guilds looked right past them. Kalen looked right at them. That was where his true forge lay. A cart without coats of arms rolled into Turvin on market day, and no one paid it any mind. A thin man in gloves walked around the square for an hour. He didn't ask any questions. He touched things. The rim of a well bucket, a door hinge at the school, roof tiles stacked against the wall, the edge of a gray piece of cloth on Nera's counter. After each touch, he closed his eyes for a moment. He stood longest at Nera's counter. Then he bought a scrap, paid without haggling, and left without staying the night. Kalen only learned of the visitor that evening from Isla, who had noticed the gloves in the heat. He questioned her, drew out all the details, and realized he was too late. The trace reader had come in person and taken the sample. That same evening, the system opened a window and confirmed the worst. It stated that the trace of enhanced abilities had been read as belonging to a bearer of an alien gift, that the reading level was high, and that the bearer of the alien gift was currently heading toward the city of Vreden. 6 days later, a boy from Sorgat galloped into Turvin with a letter. The merchant's handwriting was crooked and hasty. He wrote that trouble had struck the city, that Master Cross had convened a guild council and declared Turvin iron to be witchcraft, that a ban had been read out in the workshops prohibiting the purchase and transport of any goods from Turvin under penalty of having their seals revoked, that 2 middlemen who had been trading in knives had already been dragged from their shops and were being held in the guild's basement, and that Sorgat himself was moving his wagons out of Vreden just to be on the safe side, but was issuing a final warning. Cross has banned the goods, but not the village, and that means he doesn't want to strangle the village, he wants to take it over, along with all its secrets. Kalen read the letter 3 times and gathered everyone at the school, Darg, Nehru, Tab, Isla, Verdu, and Halda. He placed the letter on the table and told them exactly as it was, that trade through Vreden was dead, that the guild would come, and that it would come soon, and that they had a choice between 2 paths: hide the machines, bury the steel, and once again become a destitute village that might be forgiven, or, before the guild arrived, become something that couldn't be taken away. He expected an argument. There was no argument. Nera asked only how much time they had. Halda asked what was needed from the community. Dargo silently placed his hammer on the table as a sign that he was in on the plan. And then Kalen unfurled a large sheet of paper on the table, and the village saw for the first time what he had been sketching at night for the past month. On the sheet was Turvin as it was meant to be. A ring of living masonry walls, a tower catching the wind above the millstones, a water conduit from the weir, furnaces, workshops. A road south, bypassing Vreden, to the river wharf, from where goods could be shipped downstream to lands beyond the reach of the cross. Tobe looked at the drawing, and the old man's lips trembled. He said that building something like this takes 10 years. Kalen replied that they didn't have 10 years. They had until spring. And that everyone would build, and that anyone who taught another their craft would double the village's workforce. He didn't tell them the most important thing, that each of their successes made him 1,000 times stronger, and that the village growing around him was his true system. They parted ways after midnight, and 2 days later, horsemen appeared on the northern road. There were 4 of them. Riding ahead on a black horse was a man whom Kalen had never seen before, but recognized immediately by the way his entourage remained silent behind him, and by the way he surveyed the village from his saddle with the gaze of a master taking inventory of his property. Master Vale Cross had come to Turvin in person. Cross did not go to the village headman. He rode straight to the school, and that spoke to Kalen more than any words could. The guest knew where to look. He dismounted at the porch, removed his glove, and placed his bare palm on the masonry of the wall. He stood there for a long time. His retinue waited. The village watched from a distance. Then Cross put on his glove, turned around, and asked the crowd who the foreman was. His voice was quiet, and at that quietness, the square fell silent as if a bell had rung. Kalen stepped forward. Cross looked him over from head to toe and wasn't surprised. He said that a person's character wasn't revealed by their age, but by their track record, and that there was only one track here, everywhere. He spoke calmly, like a man who'd never had any reason to raise his voice. He said he hadn't come to punish anyone, that the ban on the goods was simply a door he'd closed to speak without a draft, and that he had a proposal. The Iron Circle Guild will accept Master Kalen into the workshop immediately as a senior craftsman, bypassing all the ranks. A house in Vreden, the foundry yard, a share from the 3 provinces. All the local craftsmen will receive the guild's seals and protection. The village will be exempt from all future taxes for 10 years. In exchange for one thing. Master Kalen works under the guild's umbrella, and all new techniques must go through the workshop. The offer was generous. It was so generous that Hald swallowed noisily behind his back. Cross knew how to make a deal. Kalen asked what would happen to the techniques the workshop deemed superfluous. For the first time, Cross smiled and answered honestly. He said that the surplus would be stored in the workshop's vault. That was how the system worked. New knowledge must be released into the world drop by drop. Otherwise, it overwhelms those who stand in its way. He said this without malice. That was truly how he lived. Kalen looked at him and saw his own past life reflected there. The workshops, the locks on the books, secrets taken to the grave. A world where knowledge lies in the basement and grows in value precisely because no one can get their hands on it. He had played by those rules his whole life and died rich yet empty-handed. The system had given him the opposite rule. Give, and you will receive 1,000-fold. These 2 laws could not coexist in the same world. One had to devour the other. Kalen replied that he was grateful for the honor, but declined. A collective sigh swept across the square. Cross's expression didn't change. He nodded like a man who'd received the expected answer and said he'd give him until the first snowfall to change his mind. Then he stepped closer and added quietly, just for Kalen. He said he'd read his trail and that the trail was strange, that no living hand works that way. That's how a hand works that has been learning longer than a man has lived, and that he was very eager to find out where such hands came from. He rode off without looking back. But Kalen remained standing, a chill between his shoulder blades, because Cross had come closer to the truth than anyone else in this world. The village decided that the storm had passed. Kalen knew the storm was only just gathering. He doubled the pace of construction. Now they worked by torchlight. The wall of living masonry arched upward from the dam, and Tob drove the crew so hard that the men howled. Yet in the evenings they came of their own accord to watch the seams fuse together. Nira and her friends were no longer weaving scraps but rolls of fabric, and the first jackets made of gray cloth went to the sentries whom Hald had stationed on both roads. Darg and Isla were casting arrowheads and the ironwork for the gates. Verda was firing roof tiles that hail hadn't damaged, which meant a flaming arrow wouldn't damage them either. Kalen was everywhere at once, and at night he marked out the road to the south. And he counted down the days until the snow. The attack came before the snow, and it didn't come from the road. On a moonless night, Naira's house by the dam caught fire. It caught fire strangely. It started at all 4 corners at once. The sentry on the southern road lay in a ditch with a fractured skull, breathing erratically. The villagers poured water from buckets, but they couldn't get close to the house. The flames stood like a wall. And then Naira emerged from the fire. She was carrying her youngest apprentice, the girl Tila, in her arms. Both were wrapped from head to toe in gray cloth. The cloth smoldered but did not burn. The fire ran off it like water off a goose's feather. Naira walked through her own burning house, from the farthest room to the door, and carried out the child and bundles of finished fabric without suffering a single burn. The villagers watched in silence. Many crossed themselves. But Kalin looked at the house. The living mortar with which, at his insistence, Tob had reinforced the homes of all the craftsmen a month earlier, trapped the fire within the walls, preventing it from spreading to neighboring roofs. The house burned like a candle in a stone glass. By dawn, it had burned out from the inside, and the walls remained standing. The loom was burned to ashes. The fabric was saved. The people were alive. In the ashes, they found what they were looking for: 4 clay pots containing the remains of earth oil. Arson. And in the coastal bushes, sentries from the northern road captured a man who hadn't managed to escape because he'd sprained his leg in the darkness on the stones of the water channel. They brought him to the square in front of the entire crowd. The man remained silent. Then Kalin asked for his knife and boots to be brought to him, and, in front of everyone, read them aloud as if they were a book. He said that the knife had been forged in Vreden at the foundry and named the maker's mark. That the soles had been padded by the town shoemaker from the hill. That the calluses on his palms were from rains, not from a pickaxe. The man listened as his life was read aloud and broke down before everyone's eyes. By the end, he confessed everything himself. He had been hired by the guild guard's foreman. The money was paid through the office of the scribe Merrick. The order was simple: to burn down the weaver's house along with the fabric, because the fabric frightened Cross more than steel. Steel cuts through the body. Fabric dispels the fear of the guild's iron. The square buzzed so loudly that the jackdaws took flight from the rooftops. Hald suggested taking the arsonist to the royal judge in the distant city. Darg suggested not taking him anywhere. Kalin raised his hand and said something else. He said the arsonist would be released with a letter. And he dictated the letter in front of everyone. In the letter, he wrote to Master Cross that the village of Turvin had received his official reply before the first snowfall, that the burned-down house was already being rebuilt and would be completed in 6 days, that the village was billing the guild for the work and the materials, and that from now on, anyone who came to Turvin with fire would leave with a detailed account of what they had seen, because the village had nothing left to hide. Let them look. They wouldn't be able to repeat it anyway. The arsonist was put on his own horse, and he rode off, as white as flour. The village dispersed, proud and angry and ready for anything. As for Kalin, he returned to the academy, sat down at his drawings, and allowed himself a single moment of weakness. His hands were shaking. The night could have ended with a dead Naira and a dead child, and he knew that better than anyone. The system popped up a window. It reported that the first instance of a life being saved through enhanced skill had been recorded, and that the law of return was being expanded. From now on, skills would grow not only from training, but also from how students applied what they'd been taught. Kalin read it and didn't even have time to process it because there was a knock at the school door. Standing on the threshold was Sorgot, a boy drenched from his ride, holding a new letter. Kalin opened it by candlelight. Sorgot was writing from the river port in the south. He wrote that he had found buyers for Turvin goods further down the river and that he was ready to negotiate a deal. But that wasn't why he was writing. He wrote that 3 days ago, a barge flying the flag of House of Geldern from the capital had arrived at the port 3 days earlier. That Geldern's men were buying up all kinds of goods from Turvin at any price in every market. That they were asking questions about the village, the blacksmith, the weaver, and the young craftsman, and writing down the answers in a book. And that their leader had said one thing in the tavern, openly and with a laugh, that made Sorgot sit down immediately to write this letter. He said that the Iron Circle Guild could keep meddling with the village as much as it wanted, because the Geldern house doesn't deal with villages. The house of Geldern deals with crowns. And that in the spring, when the floodwaters rise, guests will arrive in Turven, in whose presence Master Cross will appear to be nothing more than a village tax collector. Snow fell the night after Sorgot's letter, and it fell early. The roads were blocked. Turven was left on its own for the entire winter, and Kalin realized that winter was a gift. Cross would not wage war through the snowdrifts. House Heldern would not sail in before the spring flood. The village had 4 months that no one could take away. He gathered the masters at the school on the very first snowy morning and said that winter would be their forge, that by spring every master was required to train 3 apprentices. Dargo grumbled that teaching took longer than doing the work himself. Kalin replied that a village that relies solely on a single pair of hands dies along with those hands. Naira settled the argument. She said she'd already taken on 5 apprentices and that if the blacksmith was afraid of them, he should send them to her at the forge. Dargo flushed, and by evening, 3 young men from the neighboring valley were standing by the forge. Winter began with a succession of short, bright days. Here, in the December blizzards, the school is packed with people so that the windows fog up from the inside, and Tob sketches the cross-section of a tower on the wall with charcoal while 30 heads turn to follow his hand. Here, in January, Isla herself leads the first melting of colored glass, and a plate the color of the evening sky emerges from the mold, and her 5 girls squeal so loudly that the snow falls from the roof. Here is Verda in February, firing up a new, large kiln and pulling out tableware that rings out in a chorus of different tones, while the merchants fight over the right to take it to the spring fair. Here, sentries in gray canvas jackets stand on the wall in the icy wind for 4 hours at a time without feeling the cold, and tales of this are already being told throughout the 3 valleys. The bell in Kalin's head rang all winter long. The returns came one after another because the students also counted. The system tracked the chain. Darg taught the young man, and the young man taught his younger brother, and both successes went into Kalin's tally. By midwinter, he had mastered the art of glassblowing, which made the palaces of his past world seem like barns. He mastered the cooper's trade, with barrels that kept wine cold for 100 years. He learned the leatherworking craft from an old man from a farmstead who had been brought in by Slay, half dead from boredom, and whom they could no longer take back because he had chosen to stay. And at the end of winter came the return Kalin had been waiting for more than anything. He had been teaching Hald since the fall. Not a craft, accounting and order. How to keep the books, how to divide up the work, how to set prices so that bargaining would sustain rather than rob. The village head huffed and puffed and snapped his quills, but in the last month of winter, without any prompting, he himself reorganized the entire village's accounting into a double entry system, balanced the books, and the bell rang. The system restored the art of management, and Kalin sat poring over this restoration until morning because he had never mastered it before. He could now see the flows. People, goods, money, and rumors moved before his inner gaze like water in a riverbed, and he saw where the riverbed narrowed and where it eroded the banks. He saw that Turven was no longer a village. 400 people were spending the winter in Turven, compared to the previous 1,500. And he saw in the flows a thin, dirty trickle that shouldn't have been there. Someone inside the walls was passing information to the outside. The trickle was regular, once a week, on market days, when sleds carrying provisions arrived from the outlying farms. Kalin did not arrest anyone. He marked the trickle and waited for spring. Spring came in 4 days. The river broke up with a cannon-like roar, and the first barge rose up from the floodwaters below. But it was neither Gelder's barge nor Sorgot's wagon train. It was a royal mail boat, and it carried a document bearing the province's coat of arms. The governor of Ostmark province informed the community of Turven that he had received reports of sorcery being practiced without royal permission. He also stated that within a month, a royal inspection team would arrive in the village to conduct an investigation and pass judgment. At the bottom was the governor's seal, and next to it, a second, smaller seal. The seal of the expert assigned to the inspection, Guildmaster Vale Cross. Hald read it and sat down. He said that this was the end of it. That one could stand up to the guild, but not to the crown. That practicing sorcery without permission meant the stake. Kalen took the paper and read it with the eyes of the skill he had acquired that winter, and he saw not a sentence, but a need. The governor hadn't ordered his arrest. The governor had ordered an inspection and a judgment. This meant that word of Turvin was already spreading in the capital, and the governor wanted to examine the merchandise first. Cross had managed to reach the provincial chancellery, but had failed to obtain an order to crush the village. Only the role of an expert. He would stand beside the inspector and interpret what he saw. The entire battle would hinge on whose eyes the inspector would use to view Turvin. Kalen gathered the craftsmen and explained the plan. The village was hiding nothing. The village was preparing a display. The inspector did not need to be persuaded, but rather won over completely by the one thing the crown loves more than order: utility. Roads, bridges, glass, cloth for the soldiers, roof tiles for the arsenals. Each craftsman is preparing an item that will make the royal official's eyes light up. And the second part of the plan, which he revealed only to Hald and Darg: the informant. Before the inspection, the spy within the walls would surely carry the most important information he knew to his master, and Kalen intended to feed him exactly what he needed. He let a cautious rumor spread through the academy that the main secret of Turvin's steel was powder from a cave behind the northern ridge, and that the village was hiding its supply of the powder in a glacier beneath the academy. On the next market day, the rumor began to spread. And a week later, the sentries spotted 3 strangers on the northern ridge with pickaxes and sacks, chipping away at an empty cave. The strangers were let go with a laugh. But Kalen wasn't laughing. He watched from the tower window as they headed north and thought that now he knew 2 things. The spy was among those 20 people who had heard the rumor, and Cross believed that a secret could be carried away in a sack. That was his weakness. A man who could read things didn't believe in a power that couldn't be held in his hands. The day before the inspection arrived, 6 barges came up the river at once. 5 flew the Sorgot flag, carrying goods and supplies. The 6th came last, without a flag or cargo, sitting high in the water. A woman in a dark woolen travel coat stepped from its deck onto the pier. She was about 30 years old, as calm as a winter river. A single trunk was carried behind her. She surveyed the pier, the wall, and the tower with the long, measured gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating what they saw in terms of money, and asked the dock workers where she could find Master Kalen. A dock worker asked how he should report her. She replied that her name was Selma Geldern, and that the House of Geldern had decided not to wait until others' tongues had spread the news about Turvin. Selma Geldern did not waste time exploring the village. She asked for a table and 2 chairs and an hour of private conversation. Kalen received her in the upper room of the tower, from which the entire construction site was visible. She sat with her back to the window, and that, too, was a decision. She was showing that she wasn't interested in the view. She opened the chest. Inside the chest lay Turvin items: a knife from the first batch, a scrap of gray cloth, Verda's bowl, a window pane the color of the evening sky, somehow purchased from one of the middlemen, and, wrapped separately in velvet, a shard of brick, one of those that Tob had rejected last fall and ordered to be buried in a rutted road. Over the winter, the House of Geldern had gathered everything within reach, including trash. Selma laid the items out in a row like cards and said that the house had conducted an appraisal. That a knife is a craft. Fabric is a strategic commodity. Glass is a luxury. But brick is power. Because walls made of such stone alter the price of any war, and thus the price of any peace. She spoke evenly, without a single superfluous word, and Kalen listened and realized that, for the first time since his rebirth, he was speaking with a person who saw the whole picture. She laid out the proposal. The House of Geldern would buy up everything Turvin produced for the next 5 years at prices 3 times higher than those in Vreden. The house would station its own barges and guards on the river. The house would resolve the issue with the crown because it had its own connections in the capital. In exchange, exclusivity. Turvin would not sell so much as a nail to anyone but the Helderns. Kalen asked what would happen if he refused. Selma replied without hesitation that the house would still be the buyer, only the prices would be different, and that the doors in the capital could swing either way. She wasn't threatening him. She was simply stating the facts. Kalen stood up, walked to the window, and made her turn toward the light. Down below, Tobb's guild was erecting the gate on the southern road. He asked if she could see how many people were there. She said there were about 40. He said that in the fall, none of those 40 knew how to do anything but wield a pickaxe. And now, any one of them could lay a stone. And that in a year, there would be 400 like them. And in 5 years, 4,000. Because Turvin doesn't sell things. Turvin cultivates masters. And he asked how the House of Geldern planned to buy, 5 years in advance, something that didn't yet exist and had no name. Selma was silent for a long time. Then, for the first time during the conversation, she smiled and said that she had reported to the head of the house that the village would be easy, but now she saw that she was wrong, and that this was the best news of her trip. The house doesn't like simple partners. The house devours simple partners, but grows rich off complex ones. She had waived the exclusivity clause herself. They agreed on something else. The Helderns get first dibs on 1/3 of the goods and set up a trading post at the pier. Turvin remains free to do as he pleases with the remaining 2/3. As for the crown, Selma said one thing. The auditor's name is Counselor Farlan. He is an old man, honest and incorruptible, and that is why everyone sends him wherever they can spare him. He has only one weakness. For 40 years he has been writing notes to the king about the deplorable condition of the province's roads and bridges, and for 40 years they've been swept under the rug. Kalen listened to this and spent the 3 days leading up to the inspection rearranging the display. The inspection party arrived around noon along a muddy road. 20 mounted guards, clerks. Cross, on a black horse, looked like a man riding out to collect his winnings. And ahead, in an open wagon, sat a gaunt old man in black, who kept his back straight despite the fact that the wagon was being tossed about by the potholes like a boat. 100 paces from the gate, the potholes ended. The wagon rolled onto the surface of the new road that Tobb's crew had laid last night by torchlight. Smooth gray stone without a single seam. Old Man Farlan ordered the wagon to stop. He got out. He felt the surface with the sole of his shoe. He crouched down and ran his hand over it. He asked his escorts how much a league of such a road cost. Kalen, who had come out to meet him, replied that it was 3 times cheaper than a league of ordinary paved road because the stone was quarried on site from local clay and gravel. Farlan looked up at him without straightening his back, and in the old man's eyes, Kalen saw what he had seen that winter at Toba's. The hunger of a man who, for 40 years, had been told that his work was of no video and needed. The inspection went on until dark, and it was no inspection at all, but a wild, unrestrained celebration. Farlan scrambled up the wall, refusing to let anyone help him. He tapped his cane against Verda's roof tiles. He ordered the guard to be doused with water and sparks to be struck onto his jacket with a flint. And when the jacket didn't catch fire, the old man laughed a cackling laugh and told the clerk to record, word for word, that the fabric defied the fire. He got stuck in the glassworks for an hour, and Cross walked silently behind him during the inspection, touching the items, and Kalen saw how the guildmaster's face grew stony with every touch. Cross read the traces, and the traces told him that over the winter, the hand that had stood in his way had not merely grown stronger. There were now many such hands. The trace spread across hundreds of items, and in those hundreds of items, it took on different forms. That evening at the school, Farland dictated his conclusion to the clerks in front of everyone. He stated that no sorcery had been detected in the village of Turvin, but that craftsmanship of the highest order had been discovered. He would present his assessment to the governor and, in a separate letter, to the crown, since what he had observed concerned public roads, bridges, and military supplies. Cross asked that the expert's dissenting opinion be included in the document. Farland dryly gave his permission. Cross dictated a single sentence, that the source of the local skills had not been established and could not be explained by the training of a single human lifetime. Farland shrugged and ordered it to be included. He was an honest old man. He included everything in the reports. The audit team left that morning, and Cross left with them without saying a word to Kalen, and that silence was worse than any threat. A day after the audit team's departure, the grapevine began to spread. A spy brought his master the news of the treaty with the Gelderns and of the dissenting opinion in the royal report. And this time, Kalen and Hald looked directly at the market sleigh and saw it. The information was being carried away not by a stranger or a newcomer. One of Dargo's 3 blacksmith apprentices approached the farm milkman's sleigh and handed over a wax-sealed package. The boy's name was Ervik, a quiet, diligent lad whom Dargo had publicly named his right-hand man a month ago. Kalen stood on the wall and watched as Ervik walked back from the sleigh toward the smithy, smiling habitually at passers-by. And he felt not anger, but a cold melancholy rising within him. The system had chosen this evening to open a window. It reported that a side effect of the law of return had been discovered. A skill transmitted by a carrier bears its trace, and that trace creates a bond. Through the trace, the carrier can sense an apprentice's intention directed against the source of knowledge. Kalen read this and looked at the forge. That was why he felt that melancholy. He had sensed Ervik all month and hadn't understood what he was feeling. Now he understood. And the system added the final line. It stated that the connection works both ways. Anyone who can read the traces can reach the carrier itself through an object. And that tonight, someone had tried it for the first time. Kalen didn't take Ervik that night. He sat in the tower until dawn, sorting through his new understanding of the connection. The connection was like a web woven from thousands of threads. Each thread was a passed-down skill living in the hands of others. Darg, Isla, Nira, Tob, Verda, Hald, and dozens of students and their students' students. The threads were warm, and among them was one thread with rot. Ervik. And there was also a trace of a nocturnal touch in the web. Someone heavy and skilled had walked along the threads from the outside, moving from object to object, just as a spider walks across another's web. They passed through and left without reaching the center. Cross no longer read objects. Cross was learning to read himself. In the morning, Kalen called Dargo and Hald and told them about Ervik. At first, Dargo didn't believe it, but then he did, and his face turned ashen. He wanted to go break the guy's back immediately. Kalen held him back. He said that a captured spy was a plugged hole, and you couldn't pour water through a plugged hole to grind someone else's mill. Ervik was needed right where he was, and he had to remain in the dark. Through him, Cross would get what Kalen needed. Dargo asked through gritted teeth if he was really going to spend his whole life working alongside a traitor. Kalen replied, "Until summer." In the summer, Ervik would want to leave on his own and would leave with a gift. Kalen didn't say what kind of gift. Work carried on, and a new rhythm took hold. Once a week, Kalen held an open class for everyone at the school. He would stand at the blackboard and break down one thing at a time: how to read a crack, how to listen to a furnace, why a tool deceives a tired hand. 100 people would pack into these lessons, and after each one, feedback poured in by the bucketful, because 100 people would go off and try it out, and some of them succeeded. The system could barely keep up with ringing the bell. Kalen felt himself growing. Skills began to intertwine. Metallurgy joined forces with glassmaking and gave birth to metal as transparent as ice. Weaving joined forces with pottery, and Nera and Verda together created flexible roof tiles that could be rolled up. Tob crossed living stone with a water conduit, and the dam began to clean itself of ice and debris. Turvin had outgrown the word village. The Geldern's trading yard stood at the pier, and barges sailed downstream every week. A ring of new houses had sprung up around the walls because there was no longer room inside. People flowed in a steady stream. Artisans, debtors on the run from the guilds, widows with children, a one-armed soldier who turned out to be a genius with a whetstone. Kalen accepted everyone through the same screening process. Show me your hands, show me what you can do, and tell me what you want to learn. At the beginning of summer, those he had been anxiously awaiting arrived. 5 master craftsmen from the Vriden workshop. Not spies, defectors. The eldest among them, Gorm the foundryman, his hands scarred by old burns, spoke plainly. "The guild is rotting. Orders are drying up. Cross is furious and looking for someone to blame. Half the workshop is secretly sharpening their knives, while the other half is secretly packing up their tools." The 5 of them decided not to hide and came openly to ask for an apprenticeship. And they brought news for which Kalen would have forgiven them anything. Cross had left Vriden for the capital, with the guild's entire treasury and a chest of Turvin artifacts. It was said that he had secured an audience with the Chancellor's men and was bringing evidence that a force dangerous to the crown had taken root in Ostmark. Kalen convened a council that very evening. The council was now a true one. Hald from the community, Darg from metal, Nera from the cloth guild, Tob from the stone guild, Verda from the clay guild, Isla from the glass guild, and Selma Geldern, who had been summoned as the voice of the capital. Kalen laid out the situation. Cross had lost in the provinces and brought the war to the capital. Farland's letter had reached the crown and landed on someone's desk. The Heldern house stands behind Turvin, but the house trades. It does not wage war. There is one question: to wait until the capital decides their fate in absentia, or to go and decide it themselves. Selma said that in the capital, a word without weight is just noise. Weight comes from either gold, utility, or fear. Turvin has less gold than the guilds. They have no need for fear themselves. That leaves utility, and they possess a kind of utility the capital has never seen before. But they must demonstrate it not to the mid-level officials whom Cross has already bribed, but to those higher up. And then Tob spoke up. The old man had remained silent all spring about his past, but now he spoke. The dome he built 40 years ago, and for which he was expelled from the workshop, is not just anywhere. It is the dome of the Royal Reception Hall. And every spring, during the high waters, the hall is closed because, according to the city craftsman's calculations, the dome is about to collapse. And for 40 years, no one has been able to either repair it or understand why it's still standing. The council was silent. Kalen smiled slowly. The capital doesn't need knives and bowls. The capital needs to repair what it has been afraid to fix for 40 years, with the hands of the old man it expelled 40 years ago. The decision was recorded before midnight. An embassy is heading to the capital. Tob, Nera with rolls of fabric, Isla with glass, Selma as a guide through the capital's doors, and Kaelin. Dargo stays behind to guard Turvin, and Dargo nearly smashed the table with his fist, but relented when Kaelin declared in front of everyone that he would leave behind only those he trusted as much as himself. And after the council meeting, Kaelin made one final move before setting out. He called Ervik over and, in the presence of 2 witnesses, confided in him that he was leaving to trade in the southern cities and that the village was afraid to venture into the capital because of the power of the cross there. He added that he was taking their most valuable possession with him, the notebook containing all the formulas and techniques. The notebook existed. Kaelin had spent 3 nights writing it, beautiful, detailed, and entirely false. Every formula in it had been altered just enough to work at half strength and fail at the most crucial moment. Ervik listened and nodded. The young man's eyes were honest and devoted, and through a thread of rot, Kaelin could feel joy stirring in someone else's chest. The embassy set out on the barges 2 days later. The river carried them downstream past valleys where, just a year ago, no one had ever heard the word Turvin, but now, at the docks, boys were shouting after them and waving. Kaelin stood at the bow and looked at the water. The web of connections stretched out behind him, never weakening with distance. The warm threads warmed his back. And somewhere far ahead, in the capital, amid 100,000 unfamiliar lights, he could already feel a cold, watchful pressure. Cross knew they were sailing. Ervik had set the bait. The capital, Arvenholm, overwhelmed the embassy even from the water. A forest of masts. Stone embankments stretching for 2 leagues. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys merging into a single yellow sky. Isla stood there with her mouth agape the entire time they were mooring. Tob, on the other hand, squinted at the city as if it were an old enemy. Selma guided them through customs with a single flick of her ring bearing the family seal and lodged them not at an inn, but in the small Gelder house near the Copper Bridge. And from the threshold, she stated the capital's rule. Here, no one speaks to those who haven't been introduced. A week was spent knocking on doors. Selma paraded Kaelin around like merchandise at a fair. Lunch with the shipbuilding contractor. Dinner with the head of the glass key. Breakfast with the 4th table's treasury advisor. Kaelin spoke little but showed much. A folding knife for the contractor. A sheet of celestial glass for the glazier. For the treasury advisor, simply the figure showing how much it costs the crown to replace the rotten bridges of Ostmark each year. The city began to buzz. The buzz spread through the salons, and a week later, they were summoned to the very place Selma had been aiming for, to the Lord Chamberlain of the court, who oversaw the royal buildings. Lord Chamberlain turned out to be a weary man of middle age with the eyes of an accountant. He received them standing, making it clear that time was short, and Kaelin, right from the threshold, placed not a gift but a drawing on the table, a cross-section of the reception hall's dome with a stress analysis. Tob had reconstructed it from memory in 3 evenings and had been bedridden for a day afterward. The Chamberlain stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he asked where they had obtained the confidential measurements of the royal hall. Tob sat up straight and said they didn't have any measurements. They had his mind, because he was the one who had calculated and laid out the dome. He named the year. He named the alias he'd used while working on it. The Chamberlain sent for the archive book. The book was brought in, and the name was listed there. The conversation continued as they sat down. The Chamberlain laid out the truth. The dome had been closed for 4 springs. The City Masons Guild had attempted repairs 3 times and backed down each time, demanding that the dome be completely dismantled. Dismantling it would take 3 years, cost a mountain of gold, and bring shame upon the entire capital. The king asks about the dome every spring, and every spring he's lied to about the preparatory work. If the visiting master craftsmen agree to repair it, what guarantee will they provide in case of failure? Kaelin replied that their craft would serve as the guarantee. If the dome collapses, the crown will receive everything Turvin is capable of, free of charge and forever. And if it stands as good as new, Turvin asks not for gold. Turvin asks for a royal charter establishing a free craftsman's town with the right to practice their craft and trade outside the guilds. The chamberlain thought it over for 2 days. On the third day, permission arrived with one condition that made Selma's lips turn pale. A commission would oversee the inspection and repairs, and at the insistence of the chancellery, the commission would include a crafts expert who had recently arrived in the capital, Master Vale Cross. Kalen listened and nodded. He had been expecting this. Cross had been weaving his web in the capital for half a year, and now their webs had converged. They entered the reception hall at dawn. The hall was enormous and empty, and the dome hung over it in the morning twilight like a gray sky. Tob stepped beneath it, took off his hat, and wept openly. Then he wiped his face and set to work. Kalen watched alongside him, through his eyes and his own. The living architecture read the dome like an open book, and the book spoke strange things. The dome was not sick. The dome was wounded. 4 deep cracks ran through the northern sector, and none of the 4 had been caused by settlement or wind. They originated from precise cutouts in the masonry. Over the years, someone had removed a single stone at key points. Tob saw the same thing with his old eye and gasped. He said that only the workshop knew about these points. These were the very spots he himself had shown the acceptance committee 40 years ago. The dome wasn't dying. The dome was being killed. Slowly and with expertise, so that the blame would fall on the builder who dared to argue with the workshop. The committee gathered around noon. The chamberlain, 2 city master builders, the clerks, and Cross. He entered last and stopped by a column, and for the first time in 6 months, Kalen saw him up close. Cross had aged. The capital had sucked the Vraden dignity out of him and left only his will. He looked at Kalen as one looks at a long-standing debt and said, in front of the entire commission, that he requested this be recorded in the minutes. The guardians of the kingdom's sacred relics entrust it to people whose art has an unidentified source, and he, as an expert, warns that an unidentified source at the base of the state dome is not a matter of construction, but a matter of the security of the throne. It was a strong statement. The scribe's pens scratched. The chamberlain grimaced but remained silent because the words were phrased in such a way that to argue with them would mean taking responsibility upon himself. And then Kalen asked the commission to join him on the scaffolding. Up above, in the northern sector, he pointed out the samples. He showed tool marks in the sockets. He demonstrated that the cracks were spreading from voids and that the voids had been created by hand, a hand that had been at work for many years with the knowledge of those who held the keys to the hall. The commission watched, their expressions growing somber. Then Kalen turned to Cross and asked, in front of everyone, whether the crafts expert would care to examine these sockets with his renowned gift and tell the commission the identity of the hand that had made them. The trap snapped shut silently. Cross could not refuse, for he himself had spent half a year in the capital building a reputation as a man who could read objects. And he could not lie, for standing nearby were 2 city craftsmen capable of verifying his every word against the guild records. He removed his glove. He placed his palm in the stone socket. He stood there for a long time. Then he said in a muffled voice that the hand belonged to the foreman of the capital's Masons Guild, who had died 6 years earlier. After him, the current treasurer of the guild had taken over the same work. The hall beneath the scaffolding was so silent that the pigeons under the dome could be heard. The chamberlain ordered the clerks to seal the protocol and not to say a word to anyone until it was taken upstairs. A scandal of such magnitude had to be resolved by the chancellery itself. But Kalen had already gotten his comeuppance. The commission had seen it, and Cross, through his own talent, had saved the Turvan embassy and brought down the capital's guild. As he was leaving the scaffolding, Cross paused beside Kalen for a moment and spoke softly. He said that he hated the lies in the stone more than he hated Kalen, and that Kalen should not consider today's events settled. Repairs began the next day and took 3 weeks to complete. Here is Tob mixing his mortar in the kingdom's main cathedral, and the capital's apprentices are secretly scooping up its dust into their handkerchiefs as if it were a sacred relic. Here, the living stone is sealing the first crack, and the senior city master watches this before leaving the hall on unsteady legs. Here, Nera secures the scaffolding with a net of gray thread so that not a single pebble falls, and the masters of the crown guard feel the net and shake their heads. Here, Isla inserts a new pane of glass into the dome's skylight, and in the evening, the dome itself gathers the sunset and pours it down in a honey-colored pillar of light. On the last day of work, a retinue entered the hall unannounced. Leading the way was a short man in a simple dark robe, and from the way the guards froze, Kalen realized who it was before he even saw his face. King Anselm IV stopped in the middle of the hall beneath the dome. He looked up for a long time. Then, without turning around, he asked which of those present was Master Kalen of Turvan. Kalen stepped forward. The king turned. His face was not young, but mocking and very attentive. He said that he had read Farland's report, the Chamberlain's report, and the dissenting opinions of expert Cross, every single one of them. That he liked the dome above his head better than any of the reports, and that he had one question for the master to which he wished to receive an honest answer right here and now. The king stepped closer and asked in a low voice, "Is it true, as the expert writes, that such a thing cannot be learned in a single human lifetime?" The hall fell silent. The entourage waited. Cross stood by a column, holding his breath. Kalen looked the king in the eyes and chose the only path where he could not be caught out. He told the truth, stripping away only what was impossible. He said that the expert was correct. One cannot learn such a thing in a single lifetime. Nor had he learned it in a single lifetime. He had studied his entire life from every master he had met, and those masters had studied from their own masters, and so on, going back 100 generations. Every time he teaches another person, he passes this chain on, and the chain returns to him even longer. His gift, if it is a gift, consists of one thing. He knows how to give without holding back. And everything the king saw around him was built not by his own hands, but by the hands of those he taught. Let the king ask them himself. The king asked. For an hour he walked through the hall, speaking with Taub about stone, with Nera about thread, and with Isla about glass, and listened as only very old judges and very good kings know how to listen. Then he returned to Kalen and said that in his lifetime he had seen two kinds of strong people. Some hoard strength within themselves, and he keeps such people in check. Others share their strength with those around them, and he keeps such people close. And he asked what Turvan wanted from the crown. Kalen replied with a charter prepared over the course of a month and refined over the course of 2 lifetimes. A charter for a free city of artisans. The right to practice crafts and trade throughout the kingdom, independent of guild seals, and the right to teach any free person any craft. He emphasized the last point with his voice. The king smiled and said that the first 2 requests cost money, but the third is worth the crown itself, because whoever teaches everyone holds the future of everyone. Then he paused and added that he would sign all 3, but with a condition. The crown grants Turvan status and protection, and Turvan grants the crown what the chancellery will deem fair service: roads for the army, bridges, glass and cloth for the arsenals, and the first cohort of royal apprentices, whom Turvan pledges to train no worse than his own. It was a fair deal, and Kalen agreed. The charter took a week to prepare, and that week flew by in a feverish rush. The capital had the Turvinians in a death grip. Orders, invitations. Apprentices besieged the house by the Copper Bridge, begging to be taken on as students. Selma walked about, happy and angry at the same time, because a third of the Geldern household was rapidly becoming a small share amid these new waves of activity. And Cross had vanished. He was seen neither in the chancellery nor in the workshops. Kalen could sense his presence through the city's clamor. The cold spot had shifted from the palace quarter down toward the docks and fallen silent. This silence was more unsettling than any scandal. On the day the charter was signed, the court assembled in the reception hall beneath the repaired dome. The king signed it in full view of everyone, The chancellor affixed the seal bearing the face of a man swallowing vinegar because the guild's money had faithfully found its way to his table for 20 years. Tob held the charter, and the old man's hands were trembling. That very evening, the system opened a window with a new line of text. It stated that the law of return had reached its threshold. The number of carriers of transferred skills had exceeded 1,000, and the system was unlocking the next level. From now on, Kalen could link his students together into nodes. The skill of one node would become available to other carriers within the node in a form. Kalen read the text and saw beyond the lines what they truly meant. Not a workshop, not a city. A network of masters spanning the entire kingdom where knowledge flows between people as naturally as blood through veins. He sat by the window until midnight, trembling at the magnitude of what had unfolded. And after midnight, there was a knock at the door of the house by the copper bridge. Standing on the threshold was a young dock rat with an unsigned note. The note contained 3 lines in handwriting that Kalen had seen only once before, on the commission's minutes. Cross wrote, "Come to the 3rd dock alone, now." He wrote that it wasn't a trap, and that tomorrow would be too late. And at the bottom, instead of a signature, a single word, Urvik. Kalen went. He slipped the knife from his first shipment under his raincoat and set off, because Cross's message was straightforward, calm, and measured, without the urgency of an ambush, and the word Urvik meant the matter concerned Turvin. The 3rd dock greeted him with a wet wind. Cross stood by the pilings, alone and without his entourage, looking 10 years older. And he spoke right away, without preamble. He said he had lost and knew how to lose. The Masons Guild was under investigation. The Chancellor had backed down. The Iron Circle Guild was finished, and Cross knew how to admit that, too. But that wasn't why he had come. He had come to repay the debt for the dome because he hated lies and stone more than he hated Kalen. And he told his story. A month ago, when he was still fighting against Turvin, his men received the final message from Urvik, a notebook with formulas. Cross read the notebook with his gift in a single night and saw that it was a lie from cover to cover. He knows how to read the trail of a lie. And he put the notebook under a cloth because he disdained fighting with someone else's lies. And a week ago, his archive in Vriden was raided. Not by the Crown, by outsiders. They came quietly, took only the Turvin papers and the notebook and left, replacing them with decoys. His men didn't realize what had happened until the 3rd day. Cross turned up his collar against the wind and stated the most important point. Judging by the traces they left behind, it wasn't thieves who had been at work in the archive. It was a unit that no one in the kingdom speaks of openly. The Knowledge Hunters. People who, for centuries, have been gathering others' secrets from around the world for clients from across the sea. And if the hunters took the false notebook, they'll soon realize it's a lie. And once they realize that, they won't come for the paper. Paper would no longer satisfy them. They would come for the source, for the mind that held it all. And for the first time since they'd met, Cross's gaze was not that of an enemy. Cross said he'd been tracking Kalen's trail for 10 months and still hadn't figured out who he really was. But he understood one thing for certain. If Kalen's mind were to be shipped overseas in a cage, everything that had grown around it here would die, just as a garden dies without its roots. And Cross suddenly felt sorry for the garden. He was an old workshop dog who hated the Free Cities Charter with every fiber of his being, but he felt sorry for the garden. That's why he returned the debt. Let Kalen figure out the rest for himself. Cross disappeared into the darkness of the docks without saying goodbye. And Kalen stood on the wet pilings and listened. The city's clamor, the lapping of water. 1,000 warm threads of his web stretching from the capital to Turvin. And somewhere at the very edge of the web, by the sea, he could now make out what he had previously taken for emptiness. Several strands, foreign and cold as fish blood, stretched toward his web from the outside. The hunters were already probing its edges. And the closest of the cold strands did not lead from across the sea. It led upriver, to where Turvin stood and where the unsuspecting Dargo opened the gates to new people every morning. Kalen returned to the house by the copper bridge before dawn and roused the embassy. He didn't hide anything. He told them about Cross, about the hunters, and about the cold thread leading to Turvin. Selma listened, and her face took on an expression Kaelin had never seen before. She said that the House of Geldern knew about the hunters, that the house had twice lost people and goods because of them, and both times had found neither trace nor body, that the hunters were neither a guild nor a gang. They were a service, as old as maritime trade itself. Their clients are across the strait in the Khitan Empire, where crowns pay more for other secrets than for gold. And if the hunters have taken a contract on Kaelin, that contract is worth so much that they won't back down. Tob suggested asking the king for soldiers. Kaelin shook his head. Soldiers know how to fight what they can see. The hunters work with what cannot be seen: poison, deception, bribery, and fire in the right place. What's needed against them isn't a wall, but insight. And Turvin had that insight, his own. A web of connections that senses intent directed against the source of knowledge. He just had to make it home before the cold thread reached Dargo. The embassy was assembled within a day. Before setting sail, Kaelin made 2 moves. The first was to the chamberlain. Through him, he delivered a letter to the crown stating that the service would begin on the road from the capital to Ostmark, and that the first royal students could depart for Turvin as early as this summer. The letter served as a shield. A city under royal service is harder to burn than a free village. The second move was stranger, and Selma argued with him until she was hoarse. Kaelin sent a note to Cross. In the note, he offered the guildmaster a position in Turvin, neither a favor nor a mockery. The position of chief inspector, with the right to examine every item entering the city and every person through his instrument. Selma said that letting a wolf into the sheepfold was madness. Kaelin replied that Cross was the only person in the kingdom who could see what hunters could see, and that an old guild dog who cared about the garden was more reliable than 10 hired guards. No reply came from Cross, and the barges set sail without him. The journey upriver was arduous. 8 days against the current, and for all 8 days Kaelin sat at the bow, listening to the web. The cold thread near Turvin was behaving strangely. It wasn't pulling inward. It lay near the city and was slowly thickening like a leech. The hunter was in no hurry. The hunter was taking root. On the 5th day of the journey, Ervik's thread wavered and went out. It didn't snap like a connection does when a student dies. It went out smoothly, as if a cap had been placed over it. Kaelin spent midnight probing that spot in the web, and by morning he understood. The hunters knew how to cover their tracks. That was why no one had found them. Ervik had either gone to them or been taken by them, and both options meant that the hunters already knew about the bond through the transferred ability. His primary vision had been exposed. They arrived in Turvin on the evening of the 9th day, and the city greeted them alive and well, lifting a weight from his heart in a single sigh. Dargo stood on the pier, gloomy as a cloud. He hugged Kaelin so hard his ribs cracked and immediately led him to the tower, telling him the story along the way. Ervik had disappeared 6 days earlier. He'd vanished into the night without even taking his tools. And a week before that, a new man had shown up in town, a healer. He'd come from the south with a chest of medicines and a letter from the port. He'd set up a house by the southern gate and treated the poor for free and the rest for a copper coin. Within a month, he'd become the most beloved person in town. Dargo spoke, his expression growing somber. The healer is good, too good. He cured Hald's granddaughter of her fever in 2 days. He straightened out the back of old Tobo, the guildmaster. People flock to him and tell him everything, because people tell the healer everything. Kaelin climbed the tower and looked at the house by the south gate through the web. A cold thread led there. The leech sat in the softest spot in the city, in confidence. He didn't take the doctor that same night, even though Dargo demanded exactly that. Taking the leech meant revealing that they could see her, and revealing that they could see her meant losing their only advantage. Instead, Kaelin did what the capital had taught him. He began to play the long game. The next morning, he went to the doctor himself with a gift. A box of glass vessels made by Isla, as thin as soap bubbles, and a request to examine an old burn on Dargo's arm. The doctor turned out to be a short, gentle man of middle age with tired, kind eyes. His name was Ansel. He examined the blacksmith's hand carefully and thoroughly, prescribed an ointment, and never once asked anything unnecessary. And that was the scariest part of all. An ordinary spy asks questions. This one listened. Kaelin sat in his clean house, drinking his herbal decoction, and felt a chill running through him, so steady and deep that it made his teeth chatter. Sitting before him was not a mercenary. Sitting before him was a master of his craft. A master just like himself, only his craft was different. And then Kaelin made a decision he didn't even tell Dargo about. He decided to recruit the hunter in the only way he knew how. He decided to teach him. He began visiting Ansel every few days. He brought glass for potions. Then he brought verdiclay, which keeps decoctions cool. Then, as if in passing, he showed him how to determine the purity of ash for lye by the color of the flame. Ansel listened politely and repeated exactly, and Kaelin saw a thin, warm thread of curiosity emerge from the cold strand. Genuine curiosity. Artistic curiosity. For 40 years, the hunter had been gathering other people's secrets, like cutting down other people's ears of grain, and no one had ever planted a seed in his own soil. Meanwhile, the city lived and grew. The first royal apprentices arrived, 12 bright young men and women from state schools. They set out for the capital, and Tob kept the guilds running at full speed. Selma set up a second office at the pier. Nira opened a weaving mill with 40 looms. And a month after returning, a lone rider rode through the gates of Turvan with a single chest of tools. Cross. He dismounted by the tower, looked up at Kaelin, and said he would take the position. He had only one condition. No one would call him an apprentice. Kaelin agreed, and that very day Cross began his work. Within the first week, he uncovered 2 spies from the incoming caravans, hunters who had infiltrated the wagon drivers. Upon their arrest, both bit into something hidden in their teeth and died before they could be taken to the basement. Cross stood over the bodies and said that this was how things were set up among the hunters. No one lower in the hierarchy knows who's above them. You have to take the head, not the eyes. And the head sits at the southern gate, treating children. Kaelin replied that he knew, and that he was asking for 1 more month. Cross looked at him with the lingering gaze of a reader and asked if he seriously hoped to outmaneuver the hunter with his craft. Kaelin replied that he wouldn't outmaneuver him. He would transplant him, just as one transplants a tree from dead soil into living soil. Cross snorted and walked off toward the gate, and it was unclear what that snort contained more of, mockery or envy. And at the end of the month, Ansel himself came to the tower. Late in the evening. He sat down across from Kaelin and was silent for a long time. Then he said that tomorrow a caravan from the south would enter the city, 12 wagons of hides, and that in the 3rd wagon, hidden beneath the hides, would be something Kaelin needed to see before the guards did. He said this and left without explaining further. Kaelin sat at the web until dawn. Ansel's thread was no longer smooth and cold. It was trembling, just as a student's thread trembles before their first independent task. They intercepted the caravan at dawn, a league from the city on the new road. Kalen insisted they make no noise. Cross, accompanied by a dozen sentries in Nara jackets, stopped the wagons under the pretext of inspecting the cargo for the royal service. The wagon drivers cursed in their usual lazy way, and it was only at the third wagon that the caravan leader suddenly began offering money. Cross read the leader's hands with a single touch and nodded in response. Beneath the bales of leather lay a long crate with holes for air. Inside the crate, bound, gagged, and with eyes full of mortal terror, lay Ervik. He had been brought to the tower in secret. They had given him alcohol. And for 3 days he spoke without stopping, because a man who had spent a month waiting for death in a crate has a great need to speak. This is how the picture unfolded. Ervik had been selling information to Merrick's agency out of spite and for money, and he believed he was working for the guild. When the guild collapsed, he was bought off by new people, quiet and polite. He handed them the notebook. A week later, they summoned him to a meeting and showed him that the notebook was full of lies, and that lies cost lives. But they didn't kill him. Trappers never throw away their tools. They took him south to the port city of Sarvel, and there, in the basement of a trading compound, he spent a month answering questions. About Kalen. About the lessons. About how skills are acquired. And it was then that Ervik revealed the main reason they'd brought him back alive. The hunters understood the significance of his return. Not everything, but the most important part. They realized that Kalen's power grows from teaching others, and the client across the strait had changed the mission. Kaitanu no longer needed Turvan's secrets piecemeal. Kaitanu needs the mechanism itself. A living Kalen delivered across the sea, where he'll be forced to teach the imperial masters. And to ensure he's cooperative, they need leverage. Ervik was being brought back as an expert on the city who would point out whose children, whose wives, and whose elders were most valuable to the masters of Turvan. In the fall, at the mouth of the river, under the guise of a grain caravan, 3 sea barges carrying 50 hunters will enter, and they will take the city not by storm, but at night, following the lists. Ervik finished speaking and cringed, expecting the noose. Kalen looked at him for a long time. Then he said there would be no noose. It would be worse. Ervik would remain to live in the city he had intended to sell off according to the lists, to work in the smithy, to look people in the eye. And 4 people would know of his betrayal and keep silent. And if one day Ervik wanted redemption, there was only one path: to become such a master that the benefit he brought would outweigh the harm. Ervik was led away, and Dargo, who had been listening to everything from the corner, muttered that he didn't understand such mercy. Kalen replied that it wasn't mercy. A dead traitor is a nail in the city's memory. A living, reformed one is proof that the land of Turvan can even reprocess poison. A council was convened that very night, and for the first time, the city prepared not for trade or construction, but for war. And it prepared in the Turvan way. Kalen mapped out the defenses just as he had assigned tasks to the craftsmen. Tob was assigned the river. Within a month, his work crews had built up a ridge of living stone underwater at the bend. At a nighttime signal, it would rise an elbow's height and run aground any vessel with sufficient draft. Darg was assigned metal. The forges switched to producing chains, grills, arrowheads, and items new to this world. Crossbows with steel bows that shot 3 times farther than a bow. Nara received people. Every resident, from teenager to elderly person, received a jacket made of gray fabric, and within a week, the city became the most secure place in the kingdom simply because of the clothing. Verda received fire. Her new clay pots, filled with an incendiary mixture of earth oil and saltpeter, Cross personally refused to read the instructions, saying that just seeing the ingredients made his teeth ache. Isla received light. Mirrored lanterns on the towers cast a beam half a league wide and turned night on the river into day. And Cross received what he did best: lists. He had been combing through the city for a month and had uncovered 3 more sleeper agents among the newcomers. This time they were taken in their sleep, and the poisoned teeth didn't work. All 3 knew the same thing: autumn, the grain caravan, Sarvel. Ansel didn't come to the council because Ansel wasn't invited to the council. But the day after the council, he was sitting in the tower across from Kalin again, speaking of his own accord. He said that for 30 years he'd been carrying other people's secrets like water in a sieve. That the hunters have nothing of their own. No home, no craft, no name. Ansel is his 12th name. That he came to Turvin to do a job, and the job went smoothly until Kalin started showing him glass and clay and fire. And that now he spends his nights brewing ointments, not for the job, but because he can't stop. And this is the first thing that's truly his own in 30 years. He placed a thin book on the table, his reports from the past 4 months, everything that had been sent to Sarvel. And he said that switching sides was too late and pointless because the hunters wouldn't let him go. To let a hound go would mean showing the world that it's possible to leave. They'll come after him in any land. That's why he's proposing not a defection, but a deal among masters. He'll remain Sarvel's eyes and show them what Kalin commands. And in return, he asks for only one thing: that Kalin finish teaching him the art of medicine. For real, just as he teaches his own. Kalin reached across the table and took his hand, and that very evening he began teaching Ansel openly. Herbs, distillation, pure water, a suture that doesn't fester. Ansel studied the way people do when, at 30, they're finally given their first real opportunity. And 2 weeks later, when he distilled his first pure medicinal oil on his own, without prompting, and used it to heal a bell-maker's festering wound, a bell rang in Kalin's head with an unfamiliar depth. The system had returned the art of healing 1,000-fold, and Kalin lay in the tower for a full day while the science of healing, which made him want to cry, settled within him. He now knew how to suture a torn tendon, how to set a bone so it would heal in a week, how to prepare a painless anesthetic for a surgeon's knife, how to quell plagues with water, fire, and purity. In a world where children died of abscesses, he held in his mind a medicine that did not exist even beyond the strait. And the web showed him one more thing. Ansel's thread had grown warm all the way through. The cold had left it, just as ice leaves a spring river. And Ansel could no longer stifle his thread the way hunters stifle theirs. Warmth cannot be silenced. Through the thread, Kalin now sensed him as one of his own. And at the end of summer, he sensed the hour when Ansel received the last mail from Sarvel. The hunters had moved up the date, not in the fall. 3 sea barges would set sail from Sarvel on the high tide of the equinox. There were 11 days left until their arrival. And there was a second item in the mail. The client had sent his senior representative. On the lead barge would be a man whom the hunters among themselves called the accountant, the one who, 30 years ago, had built the entire network of hunters in the kingdom, the man who had never lost a single contract. Ansel brought the mail to the tower himself, his hands trembling. He said he had seen the accountant only once in his life, 20 years ago, and that if the accountant was coming in person, the lists would include more than just the city. First on the accountant's list is always the traitorous trapper. For 11 days, the city lived a double life. The upper face was peaceful. The docks were bustling with trade. The school went about its studies. From the south, they received supply convoys as if nothing were amiss. Kalin forbade any visible preparations because Sarvel's eyes were still watching, and those eyes had to see a well-fed, carefree city. The hidden side came alive at night. At night, the guilds worked on the underwater barrier. At night, crossbows were distributed to homes, and instructions were given on where each person was to take their position upon a signal. At night, Cross sent out patrols through his checkpoints. And at night, Kalen did what only the council and the system knew about. He tied knots. A new level opened in the capital had lain idle all summer because Kalen feared it. Tying the students into a knot meant revealing to each member of the knot the weakened abilities of the others, and he didn't know what that would do to them. Now there was no choice left. The city couldn't defeat 50 or so Nightblade masters by sheer numbers. The city could only win if, at the crucial moment, everyone was capable of being a little more than themselves. He formed the first knot from the council. Dargo, Nera, Tob, Verda, Isla, and Hald stood in a circle in the tower's upper hall, and Kalen asked each to take the hand of the person next to them and wove a web of connection from heart to heart. It felt like welding, heat and resistance, and then a sudden lightness as a seam had come together. Dargo withdrew his hand, looked at his fingers, and said he felt as though the memory of the threads now lived somewhere within his hands. Nera laughed and said that for the first time in her life, she understood why metal sings under the hammer. The knot was formed. Over the course of 6 nights, Kalen assembled 11 knots, covering all the masters, senior apprentices, and sentinels with them. He assembled the 12th knot last, and it was the smallest. Himself, Cross, Ansel. Cross remained silent for a long time before the binding was complete. Then he took off his gloves and said that if, after this, he began to love people, Kalen should blame himself. The bond was difficult to form, like welding old, worn-out iron, but it held. And through the knot, Kalen felt for the first time from within how Cross saw the world. A world where every object screams about its master. And how Ansel saw the world. A world where every person is a wound that can either be healed or exploited. On the 8th day, the last mail from Sarvel arrived from the south, and Ansel brought it to the tower. The accountant requested confirmation that the city was calm, and demanded that Ansel do 3 things on the night the barges arrived. Sprinkle sleeping powder in the sentry's barracks, open the gate at the southern tower, and mark the house where Kalen is spending the night with a lantern. The council listened, and Dargo played with his marbles. Kalen looked at the sheet of paper and saw not an order, but a sketch of someone else's plan, and the sketch revealed everything. The hunters won't come via the pier. They'll land downstream of the bend on the dark bank and enter overland through the southern gate, while the barges, as a diversion, will be moored at the pier like grain barges. That means Tob's forces will catch only empty decoys. This meant that the entire defense plan, built around the river, had missed the mark. For 11 days, the city had been setting a trap on the wrong side. Kalen thanked the foreign commander for the lesson and redrew the defenses in a single night. Ansel replied to Sarvel that everything would be carried out. On the night of the equinox, the city went to sleep early and soundly. The windows went dark. The sentries on the walls yawned loudly. In the barracks by the south tower, the snoring was so loud it could be heard from the river. It was the empty straw-stuffed mattresses that were snoring, because the men weren't lying in the barracks, but in the dark houses along South Street, crossbows on their knees. 3 barges entered the bend after midnight. 2 made their way toward the pier, flashing their honest, bread-colored lanterns. The 3rd edged close to the dark bank downstream, and shadows disembarked from it onto dry land. Kalen stood on the southern tower and counted them through the cold, misty air. 46. They walked toward the gate silently and gracefully, like water flowing between stones, and he couldn't help but admit that he was looking at masters. The gate was open as ordered. The shadows filed through it in groups of 3. And when more than half were inside, the city opened up. Elena's mirrored lanterns flashed simultaneously from the 4 towers, and the night on the southern street turned into broad daylight. The living stone, at Tob's command, closed in the gate's opening, cutting off those who had entered from those who had not. From the rooftops fell Nera's nets of gray thread, which could not be cut with a knife. And watching all this from both sides of the street, with 300 crossbows in the hands of men to whom the knots had granted the diminished accuracy of the city's best marksmen. Kalen, from the tower, spoke a single sentence into the white silence, that the city offered life to all who laid down their weapons. The hunters did not surrender. The hunters were not taught to surrender. They scattered from the light in all directions like mercury, and what began was later called in Turvan the Night of White Light. It was a brief and terrifying affair. The hunters fought in a way the city did not know how and would never learn. But the city was clad in a fabric that no knife could pierce. The city saw through the darkness of the courtyards with the eyes of its knots. The city fired from windows and rooftops, and, in Tob's words, living stone rose like a wall across every alleyway where the shadows tried to flee. By dawn, it was all over. 29 hunters were taken alive, wrapped in a gray net. 11 died rather than be captured. 6 escaped over the wall using hooks and ropes, and Cross said they could no longer be caught. The city paid with 9 lives, 2 sentries, 4 Mantoba, a young marksman from the Royal Apprentices, and 5 men at the pier, where the crew of the decoy barges fought the most desperately, covering the retreat. In the morning, while counting the casualties, Kalen found among the dead at the pier someone who shouldn't have been there. Ervik lay by the gangplank with an arrow in his chest and Dargo's axe in his hand. No one had called for him that night or placed him in the ranks. He had come of his own accord, taken his place in the front row at the pier, and when the barge opened fire on the archers, he shielded Halda with his body. Dargo stood over him, black and old. And Kalen looked at the dead traitor, who had died as one of their own, and felt as if, within a spider's web, a thread, which had once been rotten but had gone out warm, was quietly and cleanly fading away. The accountant was not among the dead or the prisoners. Kalen walked through the rows of men bound to Cross, and Ansel, following behind, scrutinized their faces and shook his head. The lead barge, from which the fighting had been most desperate, was found half submerged near the ridge. Inside, they found a cabin with maps and ciphers and an empty box. The accountant had been here that night, and he'd left. Cross spent 3 hours searching the cabin with his hands and emerged onto the deck with the look of a man who'd witnessed the impossible. He said there was a trace in the cabin, and yet there was no trace. Things remember a person, but they remember him as empty, like a glove without a hand. In 30 years of reading, this was the first time he'd encountered such a thing, and now he understood why the accountant had never lost a single order. And while the city was burying its own and holding its prisoners, Kalen climbed up to the tower and saw that the system had opened the window on its own. The system reported that mass use of nodes had been detected and that the return law had risen to the penultimate level. And further down, it stated something else, that night, an unidentified mirror-type gift had penetrated the carrier's web. That the alien gift did not steal skills. The alien gift was scanning the web's infrastructure, and that the scan had been interrupted midway when the carrier of the alien gift moved beyond range. Kalen stood by the window and understood what had actually happened. The trappers had lost 50 men, but the accountant had not come for the city or for him. The accountant had come to inspect the system, and he saw half of it. Kalen decided not to hang the captured trappers or hand them over to the crown, and this decision nearly split the council. Hall demanded a royal trial. Dargo demanded the noose. Cross remained silent and then spoke a single word that settled everything. He said that the 29 hunters were 29 pairs of the kingdom's finest hands, which for 30 years had been trained only to take, and that he, an old dog, would give 10 years just to see what Turvan science would do with such hands. Kalen offered the captives the same deal he'd once offered Ervik, only this time aloud: life, a trade, and 5 years probation. Whoever wants the noose instead of a trade, speak up now. no one wanted the noose. 8 truly wanted a trade, and the first of the 8 to step forward was a young hunter with a broken arm, which Ansel had mended for him in a week, and this young man said he wanted to learn what had been done to his arm. The rest were sent to road work beneath the living stone of Toba, from which there is no escape. The city licked its wounds, buried them, and continued to grow, because life knows no other way. And Kalin spent the entire fall preparing for what only he could see. The accountant took half of the web device. A man who has never lost a single order won't bury such knowledge in a desk. He'll take it to the client and return for the second half. And this time, he won't bring 50 knives. He'll bring what is made up of half the knowledge of the system. Kalin thought about this at night, and his own conclusions sent a chill down his spine. If the accountant realized that power grows from learning, then the blow wouldn't be aimed at the city. The blow would be aimed at the trust from which learning grows, not to poison the well, but to poison the very pursuit of teaching and learning. The first warning came in the winter with trade reports. Cheap counterfeits of turvan goods had appeared in the southern cities of the kingdom. Knives that looked like turvan ones, but would shatter in the cold, maiming hands. Gray fabric that would flare up at the slightest spark. Tableware with a ringing sound that would crack, revealing a poisonous glaze. A rumor spread through the markets that turvan goods would spoil after a year, and that the miracle maker were selling sorcery laced with rot. Selma brought samples, and Cross examined them in an hour. They were made in Sarvel. They were made by the hands of guild members who had been bought off from the shattered guilds, and it was conceived by a man with no trace left behind. The second wave was worse. In the spring, 2 members of the first class of royal apprentices returned to the capital, opened a school there for the turvan craft, and began teaching anyone and everyone for large sums of money, imparting only a truncated, half-baked knowledge. Their students' bridges cracked. Burns from their smelting furnaces multiplied, and every cracked bridge screamed the word turvan across the entire kingdom. Kalin sat poring over a map of the kingdom, across which the enemy's moves were spreading like mold, and admitted that the accountant was waging war beautifully. Not a single knife. Only poison straight to the heart of turvan law. Give and you shall receive had begun to turn into give and you shall receive shame. The council proposed the obvious. Shut down. Brand every item with a secret mark. Teach only those who had been vetted under oath. Kalin listened and understood that this was exactly what was expected of him. Had turvan closed itself off, in 10 years it would have become just another guild. The accountant won the contract not by destroying it, but by forcing it to become his reflection. And then Kalin made a move in the opposite direction. He opened up even wider. Turvan declared a year of open gates throughout the kingdom. Any master from any guild could come and study for free for a month. Any city could request a turvan teacher to visit. And to combat counterfeits, Kalin relied not on a secret mark, but on knowledge. Turvan weighing and assaying offices were sent to all the markets where any buyer could, for a penny, have any item tested and learn to distinguish genuine craftsmanship for themselves. He was no longer teaching craftsmen, he was teaching buyers. And the return policy responded to this as it had never responded before. Returns came pouring in from thousands of strangers across the kingdom, and by midsummer, the system indicated that it had reached the final stage before completion. And it wasn't Kalin who shut down the school run by the 2 half-wits in the capital. It was shut down by its own students, who had gone on a year-long open-door tour, saw the difference, and upon returning, demanded their money back. The accountant lost his rhythm for the first time in 30 years. And then he did what a master does when losing on someone else's turf. He took the field himself. At the end of summer, an unassuming elderly man arrived in turvan with a standard wagon load, carrying papers from the capital's assay office, and asked to review the weight case. Cross read his papers, and the papers were in order. Cross inspected his equipment, and the equipment was in order. Only Ansel, upon meeting the guest on the street, turned pale but gave nothing away, and that evening in the tower, he spoke just 2 words, It's him. Kalen decided not to take on the accountant. He sent him an open invitation to dine in the tower, addressed by name, a name he'd learned from Anne. Jorgen. The accountant came, calm as winter water. He sat across from Kalen and said he appreciated the invitation and that he hadn't heard his name spoken aloud in 20 years. Their conversation lasted until the third cockcrow, and it was the strangest conversation between two masters in Kalen's life. Jorgen didn't haggle or make threats. Jorgen asked questions about the law of return, about knots, about what a person feels when giving away the best they have. He asked the way an accountant asks when balancing a ledger that doesn't add up for the first time. He said that for 30 years he had been collecting what belonged to others, knowing full well that the world is structured like a set of scales. What one gains, another loses. His entire theory was based on this. But the Turvan law breaks the balance. Here, the giver receives more than what was given, and everyone's gains increase at once. He had seen only half the picture and didn't believe it. He came to see the other half, and now he sees it. And yet the balance still doesn't add up, because such a thing cannot be. Kalen replied that the balance does add up if you count people rather than things. That knowledge locked away in a single person dies with that person, and that is a net loss. But knowledge that is shared lives on in many and grows, and that is a gain unknown to the science of the scales. Jorgen was silent for a long time. Then he said that the client across the strait is waiting for him to deliver the second half of the device and the mechanism's head to boot. That the catchers aren't punished for failing to fulfill an order because, in 30 years, such a failure has never happened. And that he, an old accountant, was holding an order in his hands for the first time in his life that he didn't want to close. Not out of pity, out of curiosity. He was 61 years old, and he wanted to have time to understand how the mechanism that breaks the scales worked. And there was only one way to understand this, a way that every child in Turvan knew. He raised his calm, empty eyes to Kalen and asked if they still accepted old people. Kalen didn't have time to answer. The system opened a window on its own, filling his entire field of vision, a window he had never seen before. The system stated that a bearer of the mirror gift had been detected in a state of voluntary request for training. That training in the mirror gift carries incalculable risk, since the mirror is capable of reflecting the very law of return itself. And that the decision rests with the bearer because the system was created for transmission, not for prohibition. Kalen looked past the lines at the old man across from him. He had to answer right now. Kalen didn't answer right away. He stood up, walked over to the tower window, and looked out at the city at night. The lights of the academy, the lights of the forges, the lantern above Ansel's doctor's house. All of this grew out of a single rule. Give, and do not be afraid. If he refused now out of fear, that rule would die tonight in this room before any enemy could. He turned and told Jorgen that the academy accepts everyone, even the old men, even the accountants, even those who had come for his head. There's only one condition, and it applies to everyone. Before you study, teach someone else what you know. Jorgen asked what he knew that could be taught to honest people. Kalen replied that Jorgen could see lies in things, in people and in documents better than anyone alive, and that a city besieged by forgeries and spies was in great need of such a skill. Let him train a successor, at least one person. The old tracker thought for a long time. Then he said he would fulfill the order. He would send word across the strait that the mechanism had been studied and that it was inseparable from the land on which it stood and could not be removed, just as a river cannot be removed. This would be the accountant's first lie to the client, and the last lie of his life. And he took on as an apprentice that very same young hunter with the fused hand. Thus began the final chapter of this story, and it lasted 3 years, unfolding before Kalen's eyes in a montage, just as a finished product passes before a master's eyes as he turns it toward the light. Here is the first year. Jürgen teaches the young man to read lies, while he himself sits in the back row of the school among the teenagers, taking notes from Verda about glazes. Across the strait in Khitan, they receive his written report and send an inspector, but the inspector returns empty-handed because the lies were crafted by the finest liar in the world. Now Ansel opens a 40-bed infirmary, and the plague that arrived in the summer with the southern caravans crashes against his quarantine barriers like a wave against a ridge. And from that summer onward, the sick from all over the kingdom. Then a young hunter, all on his own without a teacher, uncovers a forgery bearing the Turvan hallmark at the assay office, and a bell rings in Kalen's head, restoring his ability to see through lies 1,000-fold. And from that day on, nothing, neither object nor paper nor person, can deceive Kalen. Now it is the second year. The road of living stone reaches the capital, and the king travels along it to Turvan himself without warning. He walks through the city for 3 days and departs after signing a decree establishing a second free city in the south to be built by Turvan's apprentices. Selma Geldern steps out of her father's trading house and opens Turvan's first craftsbank, which grants loans not secured by collateral but by skill. And Hald, from whom she learned double-entry bookkeeping, grumbles that the girl has outdone her teacher. Here, Isla transports glass to the capital and returns, not alone, but with her husband, a shipbuilder, and Dargo walks around looking menacing for a week, then builds the young couple a house by the river gates and cries like a child at the wedding. Here comes the third year. Cross, aging and nearly blind in his eyes, but not in his hands, releases the last batch he's personally inspected, and at the celebration delivers the only speech he's ever given, a single sentence. He says that all his life he had guarded secrets from people, when he should have been guarding people from secrets. Now Taub lays the foundation on the hill above the city for a building that wasn't in the blueprints, a meeting hall with a glass dome. He says that the first dome of his life was for the king, and the last one will be for everyone. The old man doesn't live to finish it. He dies in his sleep that spring with a trowel under his pillow, and the entire city buries him. 40 master craftsmen complete the dome without changing a single stone. And when the last stone is set in place, the bell in Kalen's head rings as it has never rung before, because the system counts the posthumous success of all of Taub's students at once. And in the summer of the third year, the system opened its window one last time. It stated that the law of return had been fulfilled. The number of bearers of the transmitted skills had exceeded 100,000, and the network had become self-sustaining. Knowledge now flows between people without the involvement of the original bearer, and it is impossible to return it to a single mind, just as it is impossible to return a river to its source. The system stated that it was not created to make a single person powerful. It was created to test whether the world could live by the law of giving, and the test is now complete. Below was the final line. The system thanked the bearer and ceased operations. All the skills he had acquired would remain with him forever. All the connections of the web would remain with him forever. There would be no more thousandfold returns because there was no longer any need for them. The world had learned to give back on its own. The window closed and never opened again. Kalen sat in the tower, waiting to feel a sense of loss. There was no loss. There was only what a master feels when he hands over his work to the client. The web lived and glowed with hundreds of thousands of threads, and flowing through it like veins was what he had given over the course of 8 years. He descended from the tower and walked through the city. It was a late summer evening. People were laughing at the smithies. People were singing at the weaver's house. On the steps of the school, Jürgen was explaining something to 2 boys, tracing lines in the dust with a small stick. Ansel, standing in the doorway of the doctor's house, was arguing with Verda about the firing of pharmacy glassware. Coming toward him down the street was Dargo, carrying his grandson on his shoulders, because Isla had given birth to a son, and the blacksmith now held his grandson more often than he held his hammer. Dargo caught up with him, stopped, and asked why the master was smiling like a man who had finished his work. Kalin replied that was exactly the case. The work was done. Dargo snorted and said the master was lying, that for people like them, work never ends, it just takes on a different name. Look, they're building a second city down south, and there, 300 workers don't even know which end of a trowel to hold. Over there, the king's apprentices are asking for a course in mining. Over there, his own grandson will ask his grandfather in 10 years why the sky is blue, and the grandfather needs to find the answer in time. Kalin listened and laughed. The old blacksmith was right, just as people who have spent their lives by the fire are always right. They walked together to the hill and climbed up to Tob's meeting house. The sun was setting, and the glass dome gathered the sunset and poured it inside in a honey-colored column, just as the king's dome once had. Kalin stood beneath it and thought about his 2 lives. In the first, he had spent 80 years honing his craft and died a rich old man with empty hands, because everything he had accumulated remained within him and was buried with him. In the second, he had spent 8 years giving freely without counting the cost, and now stood beneath a dome built by others' hands according to his teachings, in a city that had grown from a destitute village into the capital of crafts in another world. And this city no longer needed him to grow. This was the true reward of the system, not a thousandfold mastery, not the web, but this evening's realization that everything he had given away had not died and would not die. That Dargo would teach his grandson. His grandson would teach his own. Nera's fabric would save people from the fire even when Nera's name was forgotten. Tob's living stone would seal the cracks in the bridges on its own 200 years from now. Knowledge had become a river, and no one asks a river for the name of its source. Lights were coming on below. Turvin stepped into the night, warm, bustling, and alive. Kalin watched him from above, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he didn't want to hold on to anything. The master had not finished a creation. The master had finished himself. And in the morning, he was going to start learning all over again, because Verda had let slip yesterday that she didn't understand why southern clay rings differently than northern clay, and he caught himself realizing that he didn't know either. So there would be a day, and there would be a kiln, and there would be 2 masters by the fire who didn't know something. From that point on, everything in his world now began. 30 years after the night of white light, a mail barge was sailing upriver, and the old pilot was explaining to a passenger from the capital that the lights on the banks now never went out, from the mouth of the river all the way to Turvin itself. The passenger was young and didn't understand what there was to be surprised about. He was born into a world where living stone seals the cracks in bridges on its own, where a gray cloth jacket is given to a lumberjack along with his first axe, and where doctors' offices stand in every small town. He knew no other world. The pilot knew this, and so he remained silent and gazed at the lights. Turvin had long since ceased to be merely a city by that name. People spoke of Turvin Science, Turvin Standards, and Turvin Accounting, and these words signified not a place, but a way of life. There were now 11 free guild cities in the kingdom. Selma Geldern's Bank of Crafts maintained offices in 4 countries and granted loans based on skill rather than collateral. In 30 years, it went bankrupt only twice, and both times because of people who were skilled but unwilling. The school had grown into the House of Sciences, with 3,000 students, and it no longer taught only crafts. They taught students to count the stars, compound medicines, and read ancient languages, because knowledge, once it became a river, did not ask where it should flow. Not all of the old masters were still alive. Dargo died 9 years ago at his forge without releasing his tongs, and 5,000 people buried him. On that day, no forges throughout the entire kingdom lit their fires. Hald passed away quietly in his sleep, having outlived 4 royal inspectors whom he himself had taught to count. Cross lived to the point of complete blindness. In his final years, he could only read things by touch, and he died on duty at the inspection post by the southern gate, his palm resting on a contraband crate, having managed to say that there was a lie inside. And there was a lie there. Nera is alive and old, and no longer weaves, but her weaving house is run by 60 craftswomen, and the old woman in a chair alongside the looms, and she squints at the threads and can still see a crooked weave from 10 paces away. Verda runs the Potter's Guild and competes with the House of Sciences for the best students. Ansel's hair had turned snow white, and his medical teachings are now taught across the strait in that very same Khitan Empire that once sent a hitman after his teacher. Jurgen died 5 years ago, a very old and very peaceful man, and before his death, he administered the final exam in reading lies to his graduating class, and all 12 graduates passed, and the old accountant said that the balance had finally evened out. And Kalin lived on. He was approaching 60 by this body's reckoning, and he was strong and gray-haired, and the city called him simply the Master Without a Name, because a name was not required. He had long since ceased to stand at the head of the council or at the head of the House of Sciences. The council was led by elected officials. The house was run by Isla, who already had grandchildren of her own. Kalin taught the younger students and repaired what others could not, and once a year he would set out with his knapsack down the river to see how the distant cities of his science were faring. The web still lived within him. Over 30 years, the 100,000 threads had become 1,000,000, and he could no longer distinguish individual lights, just as a person standing in the rain cannot distinguish individual raindrops. He simply felt that the rain was warm. And only this spring, in the warm rain, did something appear that he hadn't encountered in 30 years, a dry spot. Kalin didn't notice it right away. At first, it was just something odd in the letters. Listfin, the second eldest of Turvin's children and a resident of the southern free city of Listfin, was writing to the House of Sciences less and less frequently, and his letters were growing increasingly terse. Then the Selman Bank's trade record showed that for the 3rd year in a row, Listven had not been taking out loans based on his skills, but only against collateral. Then a master glassmaker arrived from the south and told Isla something that prompted her to come to Kalin that very evening. The master glassmaker said that they no longer taught openly in Listven, that the local House of Sciences had been rebuilt and was now called the Chamber of the Worthy, and that knowledge there was dispensed in stages, with each stage requiring payment and an oath. That ordinary people were shown only half the craft, while the full science was reserved for those on the lists, and that the townspeople did not rebel because everything was done gently and reasonably, and with speeches about how the river of knowledge had eroded the banks, and that it was time to channel the water into pipes, or else it would rot. Kalin listened, and inside him an old, forgotten feeling slowly rose. That was the scent of his first life. That was the scent of workshops with locks on the books. Someone in the south was reinventing the guild, crafting it from turpentine material. He reached out across the web toward Listven and found a dry spot. The threads of the masters there had not gone out or grown cold. They were alive and warm, yet separated as if a pane of glass had been placed between him and them. Warmth cannot be muffled, he had once said of Ansel, and for 30 years that had been true. Now whoever had learned to put glass in front of warmth. Kalin sat over the web all night, probing the edges of the spot, and by morning he knew 3 things. The spot was growing. The spot had a shape. Not a circle of spreading disease, but smooth edges like those of a cast part. And right in the very center of the spot where, according to all the records of the House of Sciences, the oldest master of Listven, the stonemason Bran, one of Taub's first apprentices, was supposed to live and teach, Bran's thread had vanished entirely. Not muffled, it was absent. Just as a trace is absent from the object from which it was removed. Kalen had encountered a trace removed from an object only once in his life. In the cabin of the lead bark 30 years ago. That morning, he went to the House of Sciences to see Isla and told her he would go to Listven on his own. Isla argued. She said that for 30 years he had been teaching everyone that no one is irreplaceable, and that they should send a commission, not an old man with a knapsack. Kalen replied that the commission would see the Hall of the Worthy from the main entrance and leave with gifts, but he wanted to enter through the same entrance he'd once used to enter Turvin himself, from below. And he hadn't told Isla about the erased footprint because he didn't want to alarm her before it was time. He spent 2 days getting ready. He took his knapsack, a simple set of tools, and papers identifying him as a traveling repairman without any flashy seals. Before leaving, he stopped at 3 places. To Dargo's grave, where he placed his palm on the stone, warm from the sun. To the weaver's house, where old Nera listened to him and silently ordered the girls to bring a travel jacket of the new kind, as thin as cloth yet as protective against a knife as the old armor. And to Ansel's house. Ansel listened to the story about the dry spot and the erased footprint and was silent for a long time. Then he said that before his death, Jurgen had told him one thing, not to be passed on, but the time had evidently come. Jurgen had said that the gift of the mirror is not born of itself. The gift of the mirror is taught. And that across the strait there was a school where it was cultivated, just as one trains the voice. Jurgen was certain that the school had been closed half a century ago. Certain, but not at ease. Ansel stood up, took a travel bag of medicines from the closet, and said that the old man needed a healer for the journey, and the healer needed some fresh air. Kalen didn't argue. It was more fun traveling together, partly because both knew the value of the road south. They left through the southern gate at dawn on foot, just as ordinary craftsmen do. The city bustled behind them, oblivious to their departure, and rightly so. Barges were being loaded at the pier. A guard shift was changing on the city wall. At the House of Sciences, the bell was ringing for the first class. Kalen turned around once, looked at Tob's glass dome catching the morning sun, and thought that 30 years ago he had left a village that needed saving. And now he was leaving a city that would manage without him. And this time, it wasn't the city that needed saving. It was the rule itself that needed saving. Because if someone had appeared in the world who knew how to erase a trail and place glass in front of warmth, then they weren't targeting Listven. Listven was just a trial run. They were targeting the river. It took 18 days to reach Listven, and the road itself told them everything long before they reached the city gates. For the first 10 days, the road was Tervinsk's, living stone beneath their feet, assay yards in the marketplaces, boys apprenticed to every trade. But on the 11th day, at the crossing over Yasnaya Voda, the stone of the road ended with a seam. Not from age, but specifically with a seam. Beyond that lay a new stretch of foreign masonry, very well made and very lifeless. Kalen crouched down and placed his palm on the joint. The southern masonry had been laid according to Turvin methods, but with a twist. Whatever it was in the mortar that made the stone alive and capable of bonding had been removed. It was removed with expert knowledge. Someone had stripped the living stone down to its very core and reassembled it without a soul, producing simply excellent stone that would crack and require repairs, and those repairs could be sold. Ansel asked why they would ruin something better. Kalen replied that it wasn't ruin. It's a safeguard. A living stone doesn't provide for the one who laid it because it doesn't break. A dead stone provides for the repairman forever. In the villages along the road, the picture became clearer. A blacksmith in Zamoste took them in for the night and complained openly. 5 years ago, polite people from the chamber in Listven offered to add worthy craftsmen to the chamber's registers. Those listed were promised chamber orders and protection of their hallmarks. Those not listed faced no threats. It's just that orders went to those on the list, and the district assay office closed due to lack of need. Now buyers can't verify an item and simply choose the one bearing the chamber's hallmark. The blacksmith refused to join the lists out of stubbornness and makes ends meet by tending his garden. His son joined the lists and lives comfortably, but he no longer speaks to his father. Ansel listened, his mood growing gloomy, and told Kalin that night that he recognized the hand. That's how the poachers worked when they took a town without a knife, not by blocking the water, but by redirecting it. Kalin replied that the hand looked similar but was larger. The poachers stole what was already there. Here, they're building a machine that will constantly drain the river. They entered Listvin on the 18th day with a wagon load of roof tiles posing as repairmen. The city was beautiful, richer than Turvin at first glance. The cobblestone streets were smooth, the facades austere. The Hall of the Worthy on the hill was white as a sugar loaf, and the city was quiet. Kalin walked through the streets and didn't hear what he'd considered the sound of a living city for 30 years, the arguments of craftsmen. In Turvin, people argued everywhere, at the blacksmiths, in the markets, on the steps of the House of Sciences. Here, the craftsmen spoke quietly and glanced toward the white hill. They found work on the very first day. In the lower city, near the old water pump, repairs were needed, and the local caretaker was at his wit's end because, according to the chamber's rules, only a registered third-level master was authorized to perform the repairs, and the registered master had demanded a price as high as that of a brand-new water pump. Kalin fixed it in one evening and charged in copper according to the old Turvin rate, and by morning the whole lower city knew about them. From then on, everything went like clockwork. Repairs, conversations, people. In 2 weeks, Kalin pieced together the picture, and this is what it was. The Chamber of the Worthy was conceived and led by a man named Master Otto Farron. He had come to Listvin 12 years ago from across the strait, carrying the papers of a Khitan scholar who had fled the conditions there. He was accepted into the House of Sciences, where his intellect shone. Within 5 years, he rose to become its head, and in another 7, he restructured everything, gently and sensibly, through councils and votes in which, for some reason, his side always prevailed. 3 years ago, he defeated the eldest master, Bran, who had openly argued with him, with a single blow, and since then, the old man has lain in the House of Mercy, attached to the chamber, unable to speak or move, while the chamber tenderly cares for him. Kalin heard about the blow and the care, and understood everything about the severed thread. And there was one last thing Ansel had gleaned through his craft from conversations with local healers. Over the course of 12 years in Listvin, 7 powerful masters from among the dissenters had fallen ill in exactly the same way. The blow. Unable to move. Under the chamber's care. The healers threw up their hands because, by all appearances, it was indeed the blow. Ansel, based on the symptoms, used a different word. An infusion of the deaf root. A Khitan remedy he'd read about in Jurgen's papers. It doesn't kill. It locks a person inside their own body. The night after that conversation, Kalin, for the first time in 30 years, set out to commit an act that in Turvin would be called theft. He and Ansel entered the House of Mercy through the roof using a rope made by Nera, and Kalin sat for an hour by old Bran's bedside, holding his hand. The thread had not been removed. Up close, he could see it. The thread had been driven in, just as a nail is driven in up to its head. Alive and screaming inside that locked-up body. Ansel worked until dawn with his herbs and needles, and at dawn the old man's fingers twitched and his eyes opened, and there was consciousness in them. Bran couldn't speak yet, but he could listen, and he could tap with his finger. 1 tap meant yes, 2 meant no. And within an hour, he had tapped out the most important thing to him. Farron wasn't just rebuilding the city, Farron was searching. For all 12 years, through the papers of the House of Sciences, through old letters, through interrogations disguised as conversations, he had been searching for the mechanism behind what is called the Turvan miracle. He knew about the nodes. He knew about the master's network. And on the hill, in the basements of the chamber, he was building something out of mirrored glass and dead stone. The city's finest young masters were brought there for initiation into the highest rank, and after the initiation, people returned looking the same on the outside, but different on the inside. Even-tempered, quiet, detached. Kalen listened to the tapping of the old man's finger and finally saw the entire mechanism in its entirety. Farron was a student of that school of the mirror that Jurgen had spoken of. Perhaps the last one. Perhaps not. The gift of the mirror could not create anything of its own, and so Farron did what the mirror knows how to do. He reflected. He reflected Turvan. He reflected the return system into a system of steps where knowledge flows upward rather than outward. He reflected the nodes into his own network, where those connected do not divide, but submit. He reflected the warm web into a cold one, and the dry patch in the south was not a disease of the river. It was a second channel that the mirror maker had dug alongside so that one day he could divert all the water. And Kalen realized one more thing. Farron knew that sooner or later they would come from Turvan. He couldn't have failed to know. So he was waiting. Which meant the two old men who'd entered the city with a wagon load of roof tiles had gone exactly where they were allowed to go. He said this aloud to Ansel, and Ansel nodded and replied that he'd realized it back at the ford, but hadn't wanted to spoil the journey. And at that moment, there was a knock at the door of the House of Mercy downstairs. Not alarmingly, politely. Kalen glanced down from the gallery. Standing at the entrance were 4 chamber servants in white, and with them a man in a simple gray robe, not young, with a gentle face and a smile, and the web beside him broke off into a smooth, glassy void. Master Farron had come in person. He raised his head, looked up at the gallery, knowing exactly where to look, and said quietly that he was pleased to welcome to Listven a master from whom the entire South had studied by correspondence for 30 years. He added that it was not proper for such guests to climb across the rooftops when the chamber's main doors were open to them day and night, and that he was inviting Master Kalen and the esteemed physician up to the hill for dinner, since he had a matter to discuss with them and a proposal to make, and the guests surely had questions they'd been wanting to ask. He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer, like a man who had never heard the word no. The servants remained at the door, polite, calm, 4 of them. Ansel quietly asked, "What are we going to do?" Kalen watched the gray back recede and felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. The excitement of a master who had seen a task more complex than any before. He replied that they would do what the Turvinians always do. They would go and take a close look at someone else's craft. Because a mirror is only powerful as long as you look into it from your own side. And over the course of 2 lifetimes, he had learned to approach any task from the inside out. Old Bran, lying on the bed, tapped his finger rapidly and anxiously. 2 taps, 2 taps, 2 taps. No, no, no. Kalen returned, took his hand, and said quietly that 30 years ago, a master of mirror counting had already come seeking the Turvan art and remained its apprentice. That a river fears not a second channel. A river fears only one thing, that they would stop giving it away for free. And that would not happen as long as even one person who remembered the law was still alive. He tucked the blanket around the old man, nodded to Ansel, and they went downstairs to the polite people in white. Ahead, on the hill, the white chamber awaited, along with a man whose footsteps left nothing but emptiness. Behind them, an 18-day journey away, lay Turvan, which did not yet know that the war for the river had begun anew. And only the web knew. Because that night, While Ansel was casting spells over Bran, Kalen did something he had never done before. He sent 1,000,000 warm threads to all corners of the world, carrying a single, simple feeling: alarm and direction. And somewhere in Turvan, Isla woke in the middle of the night and sat up in bed. And Verda, by the cold stove, raised her head. And the young huntsman, now long since gray-haired, the head of the assay yards, stopped mid-sentence. The river heard it. The river began to turn south.